deep aching affection echoed through the silent darkness, bound to a love so intense it bordered on despair. The heart weighed down by relentless grief, she felt the pain rising once again, signaling the inevitable reset of her fate. Standing amidst drifting flower petals, she realized with quiet resignation that the cruel loop had played out once more. Having lost count of how many lifetimes she had endured, her mind cast back to the fateful day her fiancé first met her younger sister. Trapped in a continuous vortex of time, she alone carried the memories of every past life while everyone around her remained completely oblivious. Memories always came flooding back at the very same moment, during a formal tea party where her younger sister innocently greeted her fiancé, responded with mild amusement, gently questioning if it was a bit early for the girl to address him so intimately. Watching the exchange, a bitter truth settled over her. No matter what she tried to change, he was destined to fall in love with her sister. Overcome by a sudden wave of nausea and grief, she excused herself from the table, claiming to feel unwell as her hands trembled. She requested to leave the gathering early. She caught his cold, indifferent gaze, recognizing the complete absence of warmth or care in his eyes. Not once in any lifetime had he ever looked at her with affection, reserving all his tenderness and concern for her delicate, sickly sister. Every timeline, their eventual engagement unfolded in the exact same manner, leaving her to watch from the shadows every single time. Mind drifted further back to her early childhood around age 5, when the initial talk of a marriage arrangement first surfaced in her household. Given their family standing as an earl's house, arranging a match with a high-ranking marquis's family was an unprecedented honor, sparked by an unexpected request from the marquis himself. Father presented the prospect of engagement to her at that tender age, setting into motion the long, painful cycle that would bind her life forever. She fell deeply in love with him. She desperately scrutinized her surroundings in a constant effort to prove herself a suitable partner, inwardly warning others to stay away. Despite her best efforts, she remained riddled with deep-seated insecurities, constantly agonizing over the possibility that someone far worthier of his affection might appear. Noble women who gathered around him were undeniably graceful and attractive, leaving her feeling as though she could never surpass them, believing she lacked the beauty and slender figure that typically charmed men. Sensing that he might be stolen away if she did not take immediate action, she watched helplessly as onlookers remarked on his striking presence. Later, peers at the academy pointed out how frequently her younger sister and her fiancé were seen spending time together. A companion gently asked if she was truly comfortable not going over to greet them. She quietly shook her head in refusal. Companion observed how attentive he was to her sister, noting that while it was normally improper for an engaged man to be alone with another woman, family ties made it acceptable, praising her for being exceptionally tolerant. They walked through the grounds. The companion brought up how she had even convinced her parents to allow her sister to attend the academy, though she quietly rejected the notion of being called tolerant. Inside the estate, Marianne eagerly asked her how he acted while at the academy and whether they planned to eat lunch together. Setting down her teacup with a soft clink, she plainly confessed that she had no idea. He reflected on how he had never introduced her to a single friend, nor spoken to her at school, realizing that regardless of how many times her life looped, his distant behavior remained unchanged. He then encouraged Marianne to come to the academy herself, advising her on how to persuade their hesitant parents. Knowing her past self would never have facilitated their bond out of fear, yet finding her current passive misery unbearable, Marianne praised her for her immense kindness, unaware that she was secretly waiting to see if bringing the two together would spark a dramatic turn of events. Marianne insists that she is the truly kind one. She softly denies the praise. Recognizing Marianne's striking appearance and high pedigree, she accepts that her sister is far better suited for Lord Soleil than she could ever be. She did not react with anger when confronted about the rumors surrounding Soleil. Instead, she offered a reassuring smile and urged her sister not to worry. Watching her sister walk beside her with a gentle giggle, Ilya reaffirmed her inner resolve never to come between two people who were genuinely in love. Other than rebuking Ilya for addressing a noble of higher status so directly, the sweet girl had simply smiled, prompting Ilya to acknowledge her remarkable tolerance and ask how her fiancé was doing. Brightening up instantly, Marianne excitedly offered to share stories about her partner, proving to Ilya that she could be trusted completely since her heart belonged to another man. Never in any of her previous lives had such a warm conversation taken place between them, as those around them had always cast the two sisters as bitter rivals. It was remarkable that someone who was once distant had become her best friend in this timeline, demonstrating how small variations could arise across the iterations of her life. Reflecting on the nature of her repeated life, she realized that no one was bound to make the same choices repeatedly, and everyone was gradually evolving into someone new. Despite all these subtle changes, one cruel truth remained unshakable. Soleil's tender love for her sister was the single constant that never altered. Along with that absolute reality, another painful truth lingered quietly within her mind. In a fairy tale, her sister would be pitied as the tragic heroine torn by forbidden feelings, but Ilya refused to view herself as a mere foil in someone else's story. Slumping to the ground amidst dark visual echoes of her suffering, she cried out into the darkness, questioning why no one could ever understand her feeling. A world bound by the silent weight of unrequited devotion, memories of past lives often carry a bitter toll. Dark, tormented eyes peered through the shadows, questioning why one soul alone was cursed to remember every iteration of a recurring temporal tragedy. Time spiraled endlessly around her. She found herself caught in the exact same cycle once more, burdened with the memory of a dark, sorrowful past. Reflecting on her first existence, she recalled it as an absolute nightmare, recalling how every innocent smile from her younger sister captivated her betrothed, drawing a passionate gaze she herself had never received. Determined to earn his approval, she had spent every waking hour buried in textbooks, mastering cultural refinement, academic subjects, and complex territorial management just to prove herself worthy of being his bride. Despite enduring years of relentless hardship and silent endurance, the rift between them only widened, leaving her effort wholly unrewarded. Tears began to spill onto the floor as her younger sister watched in bewildered concern, unable to comprehend the anguish weighing upon her. Sister gently questioned why she was speaking so strangely, asking if the young lord really looked at her with such warm affection. Unable to contain her boiling emotions any longer, she cried out, her voice trembling with intense desperation. She demanded to know if he was not supposed to be her own betrothed, leaving her sister standing in stunned, speechlessly hurt shock. Pouring out years of pent-up resentment, she accused her sister of feigning ignorance and constantly stealing everything and everyone away from her. Young lord immediately stepped in to comfort the crying girl, glaring furiously at her and commanding her to be utterly ashamed of her outburst while onlookers whispered in disgust. Holding the trembling girl close, he cold-heartedly reprimanded her for frightening her innocent younger sister. The aftermath of the Tea Party incident, vicious rumors spread through society, and though their engagement was preserved to avoid scandal, he looked upon her with nothing but utter disdain. 2 years passed in lonely isolation, with morning after morning spent hearing from her maid that her fiancé would not be visiting. Following their graduation from the academy, they were officially wed. Though he fulfilled the societal duties of a respectable husband and knight, he remained a distant stranger who rarely crossed her path. He reassured him that she was fine, expressing her gratitude for his concern after he noted her recent exhaustion, remembering how his small kindnesses used to lift her spirits. As the years passed, however, she could no longer ignore the cold truth that his eyes held no warmth whenever he looked upon her. Their quiet distance was suddenly broken by her younger sister, who greeted them joyfully at a tea party after a long separation. In response, he warmly greeted the young girl, remarking on her good health and revealing a stark contrast in warmth that felt like a yawning chasm to his wife. Observing them, she realized that the gentle gaze, tender demeanor, and affectionate gestures he offered her sister were things he had never once shown to her. Younger sister cheerfully offered the sweets she had brought, suggesting they all enjoy her favorite confectionaries together. Accepting the gesture, she felt obligated to host these gatherings to make amends for her past outbursts, quietly expressing her thanks. Moments later, he tenderly reached out to remove a stray petal from the young girl's hair, an act of intimate care that left his wife offering only a strained, polite response. Under the table, her hands clenched tightly as she forced herself to remain composed, determined not to repeat the fatal mistakes of her previous life. Dismissing any fuss, he smoothly remarked that treating her sister with such kindness was entirely natural, given that they were family. Hearing this, the young girl smiled brightly and proclaimed how blessed her elder sister was to have such a devoted husband. Recognizing that in her sister's eyes she possessed everything, health, status, and a loving partner, she could only softly agree with a hollow echo. Indeed, from an outsider's perspective, marrying into a distinguished noble house provided all the wealth, prestige, and social standing anyone could desire. She knew she had only fooled herself, trapped in the heartbreaking reality that she was married to a man whose heart belonged entirely to her sister. Despite the cold distance between them, he would occasionally agree to share a meal with her from time to time, a small luxury she had never imagined possible in her painful past. He reflected quietly on how he had recently relented to share meals with her, wondering if it was merely out of pity due to the harsh rumors surrounding her inability to bear an heir. Finding genuine satisfaction in simply watching him eat, she had poured her heart into today's preparations, personally decorating the dining room with fresh flowers and coordinating closely with the head chef. He had even taken care to select a brand new tablecloth, secretly hoping he might notice and appreciate these quiet, thoughtful gestures. Before she could see how he might respond, the dining room door burst open as the head butler interrupted their meal with urgent, alarming news. Noticing the sudden, pale shock across her husband's face, she realized immediately that something catastrophic must have occurred. Standing up abruptly, his chair clattering backward, he glared down at her with a look of murderous accusation, quietly uttering that it was her fault. Chilling dread filled the air, leaving her completely bewildered and frozen in place by his sudden hostility. A sudden explosion of rage, he slammed his hand down, crashing the tableware to the floor as she recoiled in terror. Grabbing her viciously by the collar, despite his servant's desperate attempts to restrain him, he screamed out, accusing her of murdering Sylvia. Shoving the butler aside, he listened in fury, as the servant solemnly broke the news to her that Sylvia's carriage had been ambushed by unknown assailants. Servant confirmed that Sylvia had lost her life in the attack, leaving her numb with shock at the realization that her sister was dead. Dark, fleeting thought crossed her mind, wondering if this meant he would finally look at her now that his beloved was gone, before terror and guilt consumed her for even entertaining such an idea. Reading the guilty conflict in her eyes, he towered over her in absolute rage, declaring that he now knew for certain she was the killer. Stammering in desperate denial, she tried to convince him of her innocence, Horrified at her own selfish thoughts, and remembering that Sylvia was her beloved younger sister, mind flashed back to that fateful day in her childhood when she had sworn an oath to fulfill her duty as an elder sister and protect that fragile child at all costs. He stood frozen as the burning hatred in his eyes confirmed his vow never to forgive her. Turning his back on her, he yanked the tablecloth off in a fit of rage, sending everything tumbling to the floor as she recoiled in terror. Plates crashed, porcelain shattered, and red flowers scattered across the stone tiles alongside broken glass. Without another word, he walked away, leaving her sitting among the wreckage in total disbelief. Reaching out toward his departing shadow, her heart screamed out desperate, unheard pleas of innocence. Locked away in a cold stone cell with barred windows, time blurred together as she sat isolated from the world. Guards standing outside her cell bluntly advised her to give up, revealing that the captured bandits had explicitly accused her of orchestrating the attack. She struggled to comprehend why anyone would believe such a blatant lie, realizing someone seeking her title had set a trap. Clasping her hands in prayer, she desperately held on to the belief that he would eventually investigate, discover her innocence, and return to free her. Days slipped past as she looked out at the falling leaves, clinging tightly to her fading hope. Yet bypassing standard noble privileges, his sheer influence ensured she was thrown into a dark cell, where she eventually met her quiet end. Reflecting on her past, she realized the entire world had always revolved around her beloved sister, leaving her as nothing more than a side character. Resigned to her tragic fate, her death seemed like an inconsequential footnote in someone else's fairy tale. Suddenly, the sharp clatter of porcelain shattered her surroundings, and she opened her eyes to find herself sitting across from him once again. Realizing her second life had just sitting across from him at the tea table, Ilya found herself paralyzed as he reached out, gently inquiring if anything was wrong. She sat frozen, disjointed memories began to surface, swirling in her mind. Vivid fragments of her past life, the people around her, and the tragic destiny that had once bound them. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Sensing her sudden panic as a teacup clattered, he leaned closer, his calm expression fracturing with concern. As he softly uttered her name, the floodgates of her memory shattered completely, pouring forth details of a forgotten timeline. Desperately, she tried to convince herself it was merely a passing illusion, fully aware that at this very gathering she was scheduled to introduce her younger sister to him. Gently reached out to cup her cheek, noting that she seemed strangely different today. Terrified by his sudden touch, she recoiled in visceral shock, staring at him in utter disbelief. Dark revelation flared within her thoughts, a chilling accusation echoing from that previous life, accusing him of taking her sister's life. She realized this experience was no mere nightmare but a true recollection of what had transpired. Looking up at his composed visage, she struggled to reconcile the considerate gentleman before her with the murderer from her memories. Understanding that fate had granted her a second chance, the moment she introduced Sylvia to Lord Soleil replayed vividly in her mind. A stern warning from her past self echoed through her thoughts. She could not afford to fail this time. She resolved to maintain her composure, reminding herself that she must wear a smile and endure the agonizing sight of the two of them together. Smoothing her dark dress, she gathered her strength, convincing herself she could endure the trial. Determined to avoid repeating the catastrophic errors of her former life, she swore to herself that she would never allow tragedy to strike again. Clenching her fists tightly beneath the table, she forced her focus back to the present conversation, answering politely as he asked if she had been staying secluded inside the estate. Delicate sister spoke up meekly, explaining her fragile health to him, while she sat nearby, a subtle twitch revealing her hidden inner turmoil. Observing the gentleness in his posture toward her sister, she recognized the deep affection he harbored for Sylvia, a stark contrast to the casual, unfeeling way he had touched her own face moments earlier. She cautioned herself to tread carefully and avoid courting his hostility. Grasping her skirts tightly, she vowed not to crumble, telling herself that her sole duty now was to correct her previous mistakes. Armed with full awareness of every dark event destined to unfold from this day forward, she fixed her eyes ahead, completely steadfast in her resolve to rewrite their future. She resolved to use her knowledge of the past to make choices that would guarantee a peaceful, happy life. Yet her sister mentioned with a smile how she had recently bumped into Lord Soleil in town. Younger sister insisted the encounter was entirely coincidental, completely unaware of the quiet unease growing within her. Continuing her cheerful explanation, her sister shared that Lord Soleil had visited specifically while she had been away, departing just moments before her return. Despite her desperate hopes that choosing a different path would alter history, the exact same sequence of events from her previous life began unfolding once more, as if guided by an irresistible fate. As her sister chattered on about how brightly Lord Soleil had smiled during their meeting, she felt a chill at how closely history was repeating itself. Drowning in silent dread, she began to wonder if her words and actions were merely scripted lines written by an unknown entity rather than her own living reality. Just as it had occurred in her first life, the timeline pushed forward until she and Soleil were ultimately joined in marriage. Shortly after their union, scandalous rumors began echoing through high society regarding Earl Bloa's sudden arrest for embezzlement. Whispers filled the corridors of nobility, with onlookers questioning whether the entire affair had been an elaborate trap carefully arranged by the High Madam. Navigating the vicious rumors of fraud and betrayal aimed at her house, she was forced to steel her resolve and project absolute strength. Unwavering composure in the face of political intrigue quickly earned the admiration of the aristocracy, who praised her as a formidable marchioness. Knowing her husband stood targeted by opportunists looking to exploit him, She resolved to act as his shield regardless of the personal cost. She cast aside the fragile child she once was, reshaping herself into a shrewd decision-maker capable of surviving in a cold world. Stepping into the shadows to conduct her own investigations, an informant quietly summoned her from the darkness. Deploying every resource at her disposal to capture the bandits who had targeted her sister, she uncovered a shocking revelation. The attack had been meticulously planned from the start. She realized her enemies had taken advantage of her sister's death to ensnare her, leaving her with no choice but to change the course of destiny. Unable to guarantee Sylvia's safety entirely, she had given strict orders for her sister not to venture outside while quietly dispatching secret guards and sending her husband to her side. She was resolute in her decision, knowing that altering the relentless flow of events was the only way to avert disaster. To divert the timeline from its tragic conclusion, she had approached Lord Soleil, claiming Sylvia was in poor health and asking him to keep her company for just one day. He had readily agreed to her request. Acknowledging her own inability to protect Sylvia alone, she swallowed her reluctance to let them meet, trusting him as the only person capable of safeguarding her little sister. She knew he was likely thinking of Sylvia rather than her. She accepted the pain, consoling herself with the thought that having him beside her was enough. Dawn broke without any incoming messages. She allowed herself to hope that Sylvia was safe and sound, impatiently waiting for his return while the servants went about their morning routine. Unable to contain her anxiety any longer, she flung the grand doors open and urgently demanded the attendant tell her where Lord Soleil was and how Sylvia was faring. The servant reported that although he had remained by her bedside throughout the entire ordeal, Sylvia's condition had successfully stabilized. Overwhelmed by intense relief, her strength failed her and she collapsed to her knees in tears, prompting the servant to call out in worry. Gasping out her gratitude, she expressed how deeply relieved she was that her sister was out of harm's way. Looking back on all her desperate interventions, she felt a profound sense of peace knowing that her grueling efforts had not been in vain. Having successfully escaped a fate ending in tragedy, she savored the precious time with her sister, exchanging books and sharing joyful conversations as if restoring the lost moments of her former life. She envisioned a warm future where her husband would stand by her side out of genuine affection, fulfilling her duties and building a loving family together. Suddenly, the idyllic dream was shattered as the heavy doors slammed open. An attendant burst in with alarming news regarding Lady Sylvia, pulling her back into a chilling reality. During their quiet meal together, the atmosphere shifted instantly when a sealed envelope was brought forth and handed directly to Lord Soleil. Watching him accept it as a matter of course, she caught sight of the wax emblem and recognized her own family's crest, wondering in confusion why a message meant for her line had been delivered into his hands instead. Trying to set aside her troubling doubts, she urged herself to concentrate on her sister, only for her breath to catch as her eyes scanned the written contents. Harsh words on the paper revealed that Sylvia was in critical condition, sending a surge of panic through her as she dreaded that the specter of death was once more closing in on the young girl. Before she could even process the terrible news, he stood up abruptly, his expression irresolute as he announced his immediate departure to check on the girl's condition. Astonished by his sudden decision, she asked why he was offering such consolation, offering to pack her belongings so they could travel together. But he remained focused solely on his own swift exit. Clenching his fist in quiet determination, he insisted on going himself, leaving her standing in disbelief as he treated the responsibility as entirely his own. Heavy, silent gaze passed between them, filled with unspoken tension and unbridgeable distance. Dismissing her plea to ride together, he ordered her to take a carriage while he hastened ahead on horseback, cutting her off completely and leaving her feeling treated like a complete outsider regarding her own sister's crisis. Desperate cries for him to wait echoed uselessly through the grand hallway as he turned his back and walked away. Striding out into the courtyard, he departed in haste, leaving the household staff to offer her cold comfort as they offered to prepare a separate carriage for her journey. Left behind in total isolation, she was consumed by a painful sense of abandonment, recalling with bitterness how her parents had similarly delivered tragic news in the past, without warmth or comfort. Standing motionless as tears began to stream down her face, she tormented herself with the unsettling mystery of why a private letter from her family home had been delivered straight to Soleil instead of her. Dark suspicions took root in her mind as she considered whether this was not the first time correspondence had bypassed her. Realizing with growing dread that he had accepted the letter without batting an eye or respecting noble protocol. Realizing who must have sent the message, she knows without a doubt that she has to follow. She takes a tentative step forward, determined to reach her husband and her sister. Driven by a desperate urgency to get to Soleil's side, her body suddenly gives out. A sharp pain surges through her, causing her to lose her footing and stumble heavily right before her alarmed attendants. As darkness encroaches on her vision, the maid's panicked cries echo around her. She collapses entirely to the floor, her consciousness slipping away. The quiet void of her mind, bitter reflections haunt her. She chastises herself as shameless, tormented by the knowledge of Sylvia's passing and Soleil's devotion to her sister's final moments. He had made his deep feelings crystal clear, leaving no room for her, leaving her utterly lost. She awakens, lying in her bed. The painful truth lingers in her thoughts. She knows Soleil never wished for her to encroach upon the precious time he spent with Sylvia. Lamenting her own weakness for collapsing, she turns to her attendants and requests that everyone leave the room. She asks the doctor to stay, needing to speak with him in absolute privacy. Once the maids bow and close the door behind them, the room falls silent. She sits up in bed, ready to listen as the doctor approaches to give his assessment. Without hesitation, the doctor delivers a revelation that strikes like thunder. She is expecting a child. Stunned into complete silence, her eyes widen as the weight of those words sinks in. Her heart begins to pound violently against her chest. Clenching the bedsheets tightly, her voice trembles as she demands the doctor repeat what he just said. The doctor gently urges her to rest, but her mind spirals into disbelief. This news, a child, was the very subject of her most desperate prayers, something she had yearned for throughout her present and past lives. Yet, as she realizes that the next successor to the Marquisate is now growing inside her womb, an overwhelming wave of conflict fills her heart. Building a family with Soleil had been the entire purpose of her existence and her greatest dream. She agonizes over why this long-awaited miracle had to happen right now, of all times. Doctor suggests immediately informing Lord Soleil of the joyous news. She had always imagined that when this moment arrived, everyone would shower them with blessings and Soleil would smile upon her. Overcome with sudden panic, she gasps and vehemently forbids the doctor from telling Soleil. Knowing the strain between them and the sorrow surrounding Sylvia's death, she knows with terrifying certainty that now is the worst possible time. She sat quietly as the doctor expressed his sympathies regarding her sister's failing health, reminding her that carrying the precious heir was of grave consequence. He urged her to lean on her husband for support during such a trial. Yet, her heart rebelled against the notion. Why must this happen now, at a time when he would only feel regret? She recalled past moments with Soleil, remembering how cold and dutiful his stance on producing an heir had always been, viewing it strictly as an obligation rather than an act of affection. Clenching her skirt tightly, she begged the physician to remain silent for now, resolving to reveal the truth only once her second trimester had begun. She feared he would resent himself for conceiving a child with her and ultimately deny the baby's existence. As the doctor called out to her, her thoughts drifted to Soleil's absence. Though she was right here before him, while Sylvia hovered at death's door, she knew with heartbreaking certainty that he would still never choose. Reflecting on the course of events, Ilya pondered where things had gone awry, unable to fathom why her life had unfolded this way despite her earnest efforts to avoid disaster. Beside her stood Alfred, her faithful guardian knight, steadfast and unwavering in his duty. Alfred addressed her with his usual solemnity. She softly requested that he stop calling her milady, pressing him to consider the matter more deeply. Yet he merely gazed back at her with silent resolve. With quiet devotion, the knight made it clear that to him, regardless of her status or circumstances, she would always remain his lady. A week had passed since Sylvia narrowly escaped death, and Lord Soleil continued to keep constant vigil at her bedside. Ilya recognized that Alfred was now the only person who addressed her with such reverence, feeling as though he steadfastly refused to view her merely as Soleil's wife. Physically drained, Ilya wrestled with severe morning sickness and dizziness so debilitating she could barely lift her head. Though she yearned to return to her family home immediately, she knew that pushing her fragile body into a carriage ride risked a miscarriage. She contemplated how a normal elder sister might stand alongside Soleil at Sylvia's side despite everything. Yet she harbored too much inner turmoil and distrusted her own ability to keep from lashing out. Dark, unspoken resentment welled up within her, compelling her to clamp her mouth shut out of fear that her true venomous thoughts might spill forth in a bitter question. Turning her gaze toward her guardian knight as he stepped into the room, she hesitantly asked if he would step closer to her bedside. Reaching out a trembling hand, she softly implored him to hold it, seeking a moment of comfort in her overwhelming isolation. Alfred paused, caught off guard by her vulnerability, while she watched his surprised expression with a heavy heart. Sensing his hesitation, her hand dropped back onto the blanket as she apologized for asking too much, though he quickly spoke up to reassure her. Clenching her bed sheets in quiet distress, she wondered how much longer she had to endure this agony, recalling how in her previous life Alfred had ended up becoming her accomplice in tragedy. In this second life, she had painstakingly maintained a deliberate distance between them, desperate to prevent him from being dragged into her dark fate once again. Memories of clear explanations and careful boundaries echoed in her mind, remembering how she had staved off suspicion to protect him from false accusations. Dismissing her request with a weary smile, she advised Alfred to ignore her foolish ramblings, determined above all else not to entangle his life in her suffering ever again. He sat quietly as the loyal servant offered to do whatever she desired, even if it meant defying expectations. Knelt before her, promising his hand at any time so long as she truly wished for it. This meant he was willing to abandon his pride as a knight, discard his sword, and give up everything solely for sake. Her hand clenched tightly, realizing that all the arduous path he had traveled up until now would be reduced to naught just for her. Dismissing his loyalty as mere foolish musings, she gently rejected his offer, knowing the bitter truth. She knew that fleeing together as fugitives opposed to a marquisate held no chance of survival, a resolve she had already settled in her childhood. At the same time, she harbored a quiet dream, a fragile hope that one day things might have been different. He had dared to dream that he might come to truly care for her as his wife. Even now, fully aware of how foolish a notion it was, she apologized silently in her heart to Alfred for clinging to that fleeting hope. Dismissing her earnest resolutions as pure nonsense, her mother called out to her with relieved gratitude upon her arrival. She stepped inside. Her mother mentioned that Sylvia was still in bed with little time left to live, though she had somehow recovered enough to sit up. Calling the bizarre exchange when Soleil requested she visit Sylvia upon returning, she pondered how ironic it was that he asked her to comfort his little sister. He admitted to herself that she would have preferred not to visit if she could have avoided it, despite her own health improving slightly. Walking down the hallway, she felt uncertain about her position and what expression to wear upon meeting her. Upon opening the door, she found Sylvia breathing heavily in bed, looking up and calling calling out softly to her sister. She appeared much weaker and thinner than before, yet her delicate features retained their soft beauty as she lay bedridden. Clasping her blanket tightly, the frail girl offered a halting, tearful apology to her visitor. Voice wavered with fragile desperation as she confessed her deepest secret. She was madly in love with Lord Soleil. Her heart racing wildly against her chest, the sick girl repeated his name, laying bare the full extent of her affection. Memories shifted back to the moment Ilya had approached Soleil to deliver crucial news, only to reveal that she was pregnant with his child. Upon hearing her revelation, his reaction remained utterly cold and detached, leaving her stunned in silence as her heart pounded. Though a faint smile had crossed his face at that moment, his voice was chillingly indifferent, showing no real joy toward her or her state. Calling how Sylvia had gazed upon her swollen belly without offering a single word of congratulations, Ilya realized the depth of the rift between them. He suddenly remembered that even their mother had remained silent, perhaps simply choosing not to notice. Back in the present, the dying girl begged for forgiveness, pleading that her time was running short and that she wished for absolution. Her desperate pleas to not die alone fell on deaf ears. Ilya stood stoic, unmoved by every single word. In the end, whether bound by resentment, contempt, or lingering duty, she remained entirely silent, unable to offer a single word of comfort. After stepping out of the room, she met Soleil waiting in the corridor, immediately confronted her with harsh accusations, demanding to know what awful things she had spoken to bring the sick girl to tears. Refusing to believe her denials, he declared that he had had enough, accusing her of plotting behind an innocent facade. Soleil narrowed his eyes with intense coldness, declaring with total finality that he wished for her to leave. Cruel query echoed in her mind, asking if the child she carried was even his, cutting through her heart like a blade. In the aftermath of that crushing revelation, her world lost all color. Even when the physician warned that her life was in peril and urged her to give up the unborn child, she steadfastly refused, enduring the silent agony of a shattered heart. The sudden painful realization, she finally understood the reason behind his growing coldness and distance toward her. He realized that in his eyes, she was merely a scheming woman willing to use her own child as a stepping stone to prove her devotion, making it impossible for him to ever choose her. Following an agonizing labor, the newborn's cries echoed in the room. As her strength faded into darkness, she caught a fleeting glimpse of golden hair before slipping away, never even getting the chance to hold her child. Did not even return to the estate on the day of the birth, remaining devotedly at her sister's side and leaving her to perish in absolute solitude. Overwhelmed by profound despair, she wished never to be reborn, unable to bear the thought of enduring such terrible anguish ever. Soleil stood side by side with Marianne, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon as tension hung thick in the air. Before them stood Ilya, her features set in a cold, silent composure that masked the turbulent storm brewing within her mind. Suddenly, she swayed dangerously on her feet, causing Marianne to call out in concern as Soleil watched her unstable footing. Sudden crash shattered the quiet as ceramic splintered across the floor, drawing shocked glances toward the dripping mess beside her. Delirium engulfed her thoughts as fragmented memories of pain, childbirth, and lost innocence overwhelmed her sense of reality. As he reached out to steady her with a gentle plea to calm down, she violently yanked her arm free, crying out in protest. He hurled bitter accusations directly at him, accusing him of abandoning her in her moment of greatest vulnerability. He stood baffled by her frantic demands, while inside her mind, despair deepened over a child she had never even been permitted to hold. The young girl tentatively approached to ask if she was feeling unwell. She whirled around and screamed for her not to touch her. A sudden surge of madness, she seized her sister by the dress, accusing her of snatching away both her beloved and her infant. Her fingers clamped down with painful force, forcing a gasp of agony from the helpless girl who flinched under the cruel grasp. Intervening forcefully, he pulled her back and freed the young girl, sternly reminding her that she had never been married nor borne any children. He drove the truth home with unyielding severity, insisting that absolutely nothing had been stolen from her, leaving her stunned. He gazed down with cold intelligence, and as his stern look bore into her, she shrank back, feeling her heart pound with overwhelming dread. Pulse thundered in her ears as she silently begged for salvation, realizing with horror that she had been thrust back into the very nightmare she thought had ended. Her mind reeled as the overwhelming torrent of phantom memories shattered, leaving her desperately wishing to be released from her misery. As her knees buckled under the weight of her distress, a startled voice called out her name. Before she could hit the floor, a loyal attendant caught her firmly in his arms. Stepping forward with quiet formality, he requested permission from the host to excuse her from the gathering. Explaining that she seemed quite out of sorts, he moved to usher her away, leaving the host and guests watching her sudden departure with quiet concern. Carrying her gently down the corridor, he held her close as she stroked his shoulder, her thoughts still tangled in agonizing memories of her lost child. Once in private, she confronted him through her tears, demanding to know where he had been when she went through labor all alone. He responded softly, insisting that he had always been by her side and would cross the ends of the earth whenever she called. Strange disconnect filled her as words poured from her mouth contrary to her own thoughts, accusing him of leaving her. He remained steadfast and patient, promising once again that he would never abandon her. Fearful of the tragic fate lurking in her premonitions, she pleaded with him to stay away, convinced that his absolute loyalty would only lead him to a grim death once more. Observing her profound distress, he gently interrupted her panicking thoughts, advising her to rest so she could recover from her exhaustion. Still haunted by foreboding visions, she turned to him with a somber favor, asking what he would do if a day arrived when she simply could not go on. She begged him to crush her heart if that moment came, desperate to ensure she would never have to endure the pain of losing those she loved all over again. Refusing such a heart-wrenching request, he clutched her hand tenderly, leaving her floating in a disorienting, dream-like haze. A week passed following the incident, and order returned to the estate as she skillfully assumed her familiar persona, offering smooth apologies for ruining the tea party. Despite her outward composure and seamless acting as a dutiful fiancée and sister, a chilling suspicion festered within her mind regarding the true murderer. Night fell, the mask slipped, leaving her terrified in the isolation of her room as if unseen eyes watched her every move from the shadows. Gazing at her empty hands, she felt the agonizing echo of a newborn's cry, yearning for the child she had loved with all her heart. She stands alone in the quiet confines of her chamber, tenderly cradling a phantom child in her arms, a recurring gesture of grief that returns to haunt her time and time again. She wrestles with her own mind, questioning whether this grief is a dream, a hallucination, or proof of her shattered sanity. A eerie voice echoes through the darkness, assuring her that she is in fact entirely sane. Alerted by the rustle of black feathers, her tear-filled eyes turn toward a dark bird, flapping into the room and landing softly on the wooden furniture, calling her a captive princess and asking for her name. Before she can answer, the mysterious creature introduced itself as Crow, declaring itself to be a bird of ill omen while locking its glowing, piercing gaze upon her. Standing alone in her room, Illich is confronted by a sphystrarg dark bird that introduces itself as Crow, declaring that it is a herald of ill fortune. He turns toward the creature unfazed, noting softly that misfortune has already found her, making its presence matter little to her present plight. Mysterious bird questions if the child held in her arms is merely an illusion, but she simply denies it while observing its subtle, unsettling reaction. Questioned about how it possesses such intimate knowledge, the bird reveals that it has been watching her continuously, remarks on how endearing it was to watch her cradle the child, though she remains quiet and reserved at the observation. Shifting the conversation, she asks what brought the creature to her empty quarters, only for the bird to chuckle softly in response. Rustling its dark wings, the bird dismisses her inquiries without providing a clear answer. Explaining that sheer boredom drove it to visit, the creature suddenly transforms into a sleek black cat before landing gracefully on the floor. The feline leaps onto a nearby chair. It asks if she prefers this form, though she admits to feeling indifferent about it. Cat strides forward, noting that most young maidens are easily charmed by such an appearance, and demands she speak her mind. Verting or leaning close in its avian asp, the dark creature directly presses her on why she remains locked away in this place. Fluttering its wings, it flatters her beauty by calling her a princess, though she humbly rejects the title. Bird continues to probe, curious as to why a noble lady would reside in a room designed like a prison. He gazes back calmly, stating that this is simply her room, though the bird remains intensely serious in its questioning. Flying up toward the high windows, the creature points out the heavy iron bars restricting her freedom. He stared back at the unexpected visitor, addressing him quietly as she processed his presence. Pointing out that he had confirmed his name was Crow, she noted that he hadn't come through the window, leaving her to wonder how he had managed to enter. Bird expressed disbelief that she was fixated on his entry method when she already knew the windows were barred, leaving him squawking in utter bewilderment. Sighing softly, she dismissed her own words, telling him to forget what she had said and lamenting that she must truly be going mad, while the bird chuckled quietly nearby. However, the dark creature declared that his interest was thoroughly piqued, praising her as a fine individual and admitting he was completely sold. He offered his assistance, prompting her to question what exactly he was offering to help with. Noting how his voice shifted from that of a young boy to a deeper, mature tone that caught her off guard, Crow assured her that he would gladly carry out any request, even if it meant taking a life, expressing mild annoyance that he had mistaken her for an innocent princess. The burst of dark magic and a sudden gust of wind, the bird began to transform, teasing her about whether his offer was merely a joke as smoke swirled around the room. For her eyes, the shadowy creature reshaped itself into a dark-haired, cloaked young man, leaving her stunned as he dismissed the magical display as a simple trick. Reintroducing himself formally as Crow, he stepped closer and invited her to address him however she pleased, unfazed by her astonished expression. Drew intimately near, remarking softly on how beautiful she appeared as he leaned in toward her. Reaching out to gently touch her, he jolted her with his icy cold hands, prompting her to shudder while he inquired about the child she was holding. Pondered aloud whether there was something deeper he couldn't fathom. Noticing the iron bars fitted to her windows and pointing out that his eye color differed from his avian form. Laughing lightly at her reaction, he teased her for being an odd one before reiterating his offer to grant her aid. Leaning in closer, she felt the chill of his breath, left to wonder why he would offer such assistance and what his true motives might be. He scoffed lightly at her hesitation, asking if she was really still questioning his motives at such a critical moment. Shrugging dramatic shoulders, the dark-haired youth insisted that his reasons were entirely selfish. He was simply bored out of his mind and utterly sick of his dreary, monotonous existence. Softening his expression with a gentle look, he offered a quiet assurance that he truly didn't mind lending her a hand. He presented his assistance as a special favor meant exclusively for her, free of any cost, while they stood together beneath the softly glowing particulate light. Single black feather drifted silently down through the shimmering atmospheric glow, marking the quiet, fateful gravity of the proposal. More feathers floated softly through the light. His final question echoed in her mind, asking what her answer would be and cementing this moment as her fateful encounter with. Reflecting on the strange turns of fate, she recalled how she had met him during her third life. At first, she had doubted her own sanity, wondering if he was merely a dream or a fragment of her imagination. Yet, as she repeated the same endless loop over and over, she realized with quiet certainty that he was undeniably real, remained a constant, watchful presence in her life, silently observing her every move. Sitting quietly with her books, she looked up as Al inquired if she was truly content with how things were, wondering what exactly he meant by such a question. Al mentioned that Lord Soleil had come to visit Lady Sylvia earlier that day. Acknowledging his words calmly, she revealed that she was already well aware of his visit. Al voiced his frustration over Lord Soleil calling upon her younger sister so openly without so much as a glance toward his betrothed. He questioned why she sat there mutely, burying herself in books, and asked if she was genuinely fine with being ignored. She reflected on how insulted she had been in her first life, but noted that this time she merely observed events as they unfolded. Al insisted that she was overstepping boundaries. She gently chided him, causing him to quickly apologize for his outspoken tone. She then turned the question back to him, asking if he was truly all right with the current state of affairs. Al admitted that he was not fine with it at all. Agitated, he questioned her further, pointing out that her own father had gone so far as to install iron bars in her room, asking why such measures had been taken. Al pointed out that she was not the type of person to end her own life, recalling how her father had panicked and confined her on a whim. She listened calmly, maintaining that regardless of what others thought, she knew the truth within her heart. He clarified that it was actually her father who had worried about her attempting to end her life, guarding against the slim possibility that she might jump out the window to escape. Al stood astonished by this revelation, questioning the absurdity of her father's actions. He explained the harsh reality of being born into a noble family, noting that political marriages were standard practice, and that she was not the only one forced to endure such circumstances. She urged Al to accept this truth rather than fighting against it. Looking at her with deep empathy, Al argued that if she was miserable, she should not have to simply put up with it. She turned away softly, listening as he expressed his concern for her well-being. Al insisted that she had at least the right to speak her mind, considering how much time and effort she had dedicated to preparing for her marriage to Lord Soleil. She looked down in quiet reflection as his words hung in the air. She asked why he had suddenly stopped reprimanding any girls who approached Lord Soleil as he used to. Al hesitated, wondering whether he should speak without reserve about the changing dynamics. He reflected on her past actions, acknowledging that her previous methods might not have been ideal. Yet, seeing Lord Soleil boldly reach out to Sylvia first in this life left both her and Al witnessing an entirely different reality unfold. Strictly speaking, it was improper for Soleil to visit his fiancé's younger sister so frequently without guilt. Yet her parents had condoned those visits, treating them as normal occurrences. In her previous iteration, she had felt as though she was merely retracing her first life, but now, both Cecil and Sylvia were acting like completely different people. She pondered whether they were entirely different individuals, or if the people she once knew had ceased to exist in this timeline altogether. She reflected on the inescapable cycle of her feelings, remembering how she fell hopelessly in love with Soleil from their very first meeting, completely unaware of the tragic fate awaiting her. With every life she lived, those feelings only grew stronger, leaving her unable to comprehend why she remained trapped in this devotion. Even if her past selves were to fade into oblivion, she knew she could never forget these lingering emotions which drove her to ask him to protect her little sister. Caught off guard by her earnest plea, he stared at her with a look of quiet surprise. Silence hung between them in the room as he questioned the reasoning behind such a request. Pondering her words deeply, he explained that his desire was simply to keep her safe, leaving her quietly observing his thoughtful posture. Agreed on his promise, he conceded to her wishes, though he admitted finding it strange how deeply she treasured her sister, suggesting that perhaps all little sisters were meant to be cherished. Skeptical of his response, she called his reasoning mere sophism, prompting him to shift in his seat as he dismissed the idea of cherishing someone purely out of sisterly obligation. Bluntly called her argument disingenuous, reaffirming that it was nothing more than empty sophistry. Analyzing his enigmatic presence, she observed his dark features and youthful appearance, quietly questioning if he truly harbored deep affection for his own fiancée. He pressed him further, pointing out that her was essentially her rival in love, and reminding him that he had refused compensation for his help. Playfully dismissing her glare, he assured her that he would keep his word, lightheartedly urging her to change her stern expression. Suddenly rolling over onto her lap, he looked up at her, demanding a genuine reason or story that would motivate him to protect her sister. Calling a vivid childhood memory, she remembered when a startled horse nearly kicked her in the stables, only for her sister to step in and save her life. Passing by at that critical moment, Sylvia had rushed over without hesitation, placing her own body in harm's way to protect her. Resting comfortably against her, he listened softly as she finished her story, realizing the profound bond and gratitude she held for her fragile younger sister. He listened quietly as she admitted how insignificant her sister's presence had once seemed due to her frail health, yet that small connection had still meant everything. Hearing her describe how the frail child had called her sister and risked everything to save her, the young man smiled, summarizing that she had simply been deeply moved by her sister's unexpected kindness. As memories surfaced of her younger sister trembling with fear and holding her tightly, she confessed that she had never imagined someone so fragile would step up to protect her. Resolved to protect her frail sister from harm in the future, her heartfelt vow earned warm praise from him, who found her determination truly admirable. Touched by her sincerity, he ultimately agreed to protect her little sister, resting comfortably as she gently stroked his hair. Feeling her tender touch continue to stroke his head, he relaxed into her lap, surprised by the soothing warmth of her gesture. Yet beneath her calm touch lay a heavy dread. She knew that if events unfolded unchanged, her marriage to Sol would lead directly to the summer of her sister's demise. Tormented by the memory of past failure, she shuddered at the thought of repeating her mistakes and facing his condemnation once more. The ceremonial bells chime loudly across the estate. Congratulations are offered to the newly wedded pair, Lord Soleil and his bride. Smiling gently amidst scattered flower petals, Sylvia offers her soft blessings, wishing the couple a lifetime of happiness together. In response, Soleil politely thanks Sylvia for her kind wishes, while his bride quietly echoes the gratitude, her gaze subtly shifting downward. She reflects on how she had earnestly believed this day would mark the finest moment of her second life, standing before the altar beside him. Even as the solemn marriage vows are spoken before the holy altar, she realizes the weight of her deception, knowing she was entirely mistaken about his feelings. The holy officiant's voice resounds through the chapel, demanding if she takes this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, and if she promises to love and respect him for as long as they both shall live. With a quiet breath, she utters her agreement, sealing the vows that bind her fate to his once more. Looking at him standing alongside Sylvia, she reminds herself of the steadfast nature of the man she fell in love with, a man unswayed by personal feelings who never loses sight of his path. He treats her with a cold distance. She makes a silent, resolute vow before God that she will continue to love him no matter what lies ahead. So, under the grand architecture of the estate, she officially becomes Soleil's wife yet again. Later on, Crow questions her motives regarding the band of bandits she asked him to investigate, wondering what she could possibly plan to do with such an insignificant group. Sitting calmly with her book, she explains that she took preemptive action to prevent a terrible incident scheduled to happen in the summer of their third year, dismissing his curiosity with a nonchalant air. Over time, she seamlessly mingled in high society as a proper lady of the market, expanding her network while flawlessly performing every duty required of Soleil's wife. Second life felt immeasurably calmer and more peaceful than her previous existence, or at least so she thought, until one fateful day when everything suddenly changed. Soleil arrives to see her, but to her surprise and inner turmoil, he has brought Sylvia along with him, leaving her to wonder why he would bring her here. She immediately sensed something was amiss as her husband stepped into the doorway supporting the young woman, firmly declaring that Sylvia was not to blame. Baffled by his sudden defensive tone, she replied that she had no idea what he was talking about, and asked if Sylvia was simply feeling unwell. Insisting that they all sit down first, he led Sylvia inside while an overwhelming dread began to settle deep within her heart. Once they were seated across from one another, he wasted no time and delivered the devastating truth: Sylvia was pregnant. Stunned to her core, she managed to choke out a question asking whose child it was, only for him to crush her remaining hope by admitting the child was his. Confession felt like a physical blow. Her heart hammered violently in her chest as tears flooded her eyes and a silent gasp escaped her lips. Overwhelmed by the agonizing betrayal, her mind spiraled into darkness, screaming the same desperate, unanswered question over and over again. Bitter clarity washed over her as she realized that while she had been desperately preparing for the tragic future, the two of them were secretly rendezvousing behind her back, culminating in his quiet declaration of love for Sylvia. Those cold words pierced her soul, forcing her to accept that no matter how much affection she showered upon him, he had never loved her in return. Lapsing in solitude as her world shattered, her inconsolable weeping eventually drew Crow to her side, who softly inquired why she was crying. Driven to the absolute limit of her endurance, she clung wretchedly to Crow and poured out every painful detail of her unbelievable journey, desperate for even a single shred of sympathy. Desperate for any reason to keep living in such a cruel reality, she hoped against hope that he would believe her ridiculous story as he cradled her head and whispered her name. Gently brushing a tear from her cheek, Crow observed that her life sounded like a living hell, asking if hell was truly meant for those who had sinned. Reasoned that hell existed to punish evil, yet she had striven to live an upright and blameless life. Simple logic struck a profound chord within her, sparking a sudden and chilling epiphany. She stood motionless as Crow reasoned that if this suffering was indeed a punishment, it begged the question of what terrible sins she must have committed to deserve it. As he reached out to gently caress her hands, he questioned why she believed this cruel twist of fate was happening exclusively to her. Crow asked why she assumed she was the only one traversing time, leaving her to ponder whether her sole sin was her hopeless wish for her own happiness if this truly was retribution. She realized that wishing for her own joy was inextricably tied to wishing for Soleil and Sylvia's misery, admitting to herself that she had indeed rejoiced over Sylvia's death in her first life, yet wondering if that truly warranted such complete damnation. Crow pressed further, asking what made her think she was the only miserable one, though in hindsight she could no longer recall how she answered him at that precise moment. All she could recall was standing alone in her bedroom afterward, reflecting on how her caretakers had meticulously removed every knife, pair of scissors, or sharp object to prevent her from harming herself, forcing her to resort to tearing her own dress. Sitting isolated on her floor, she reflected bitterly on how her sister would get to hold her child in her arms, whereas she herself would never be allowed to embrace hers. Stepping up onto a stool with a quiet creak, she accepted that if this was the price for her sins, the cruel plot would proceed without any twists. The noose hanging ready and her glasses clattering to the floor, she resigned herself to the fact that this harsh reality would simply march forward inexorably. Reflecting on the past, she wondered at what exact moment things had begun to slip away, remembering the formal greeting that marked their very first meeting. Introducing herself as Ilya El Matisse with a polite curtsy, she listened as the young boy presented himself as Soleil von Nordis. Admiring her elegance, the onlookers noted what a lovely lovely young lady she was, while he quietly locked eyes with her. Everyone praised her exemplary nature, yet she could sense his silent grief, knowing he was hurting after recently losing his fiancée, who had been his childhood friend. As he kindly invited her for a walk through the garden filled with flowers and birds, she struggled to keep pace in her elaborate dress and apologized for her slowness, which prompted him to look back in curiosity. Despite her awkwardness, he politely pretended that nothing was wrong and waited patiently. Without giving her any sharp glances or rushing her, he simply stood quietly, surveying the blossoms and gazing up at the sky. It seemed clear that he held no romantic interest in her and never looked back. She hastened her steps to keep up with him. Breathing a sigh of relief as she finally caught up, their pinkies accidentally brushed against each other, leaving her deeply moved by his gentle consideration. He accorded her the dignity due to a fellow noble patiently accommodating her pace rather than walking ahead, a small act of kindness that touched her heart. Surrounded by a sudden flutter of white birds taking flight over the garden, she marveled at the peaceful scene unfolding around them. Suddenly breaking his silence, he called out her name softly, expressed his desire for them to get along well from then on, looking mature far beyond his 7 years as he focused steadfastly on the future. Yet despite their shared agreement to become a harmonious couple, a sudden splash broke the reverie as memories of grief and betrayal surged back into focus. Returning to the present, she stood quietly as he voiced his concern, realizing that after countless cycles of repeating her life, all her past memories were finally flooding back at once. She felt the clarity of her mind slipping as the memories of her countless lives began to blur together. While the events of her previous cycle remained sharp, everything beyond that was fading into a hazy, uncertain fog. Turning away from her thoughts, she instructed the maid to clear the table, prompting Al to step forward in dutiful acknowledgement. As the quiet clatter of teacups filled the room, she recognized this exact moment as the turning point of her past. Realizing that this was her only window to break free, she politely excused herself from the table. Claiming to be feeling unwell, she sought permission to leave the gathering. Across from her, Soleil gave only a subtle, icy glance, a flicker of cold displeasure so faint that only she knew how to read it. Sylvia voiced her gentle concern, prompting Ilya to reassure her before entrusting her sister to Soleil's care. Sensing her distress, Al stepped in immediately, offering his arm to guide her away from the tense gathering. Without hesitation, Al gently guided her away from the table, his protective stance offering a quiet sanctuary amidst her inner turmoil. He openly offered to escort her, a bold gesture made directly in front of Soleil. She couldn't help but marvel at his audacity, knowing he was proposing this despite being Soleil's sworn knight and her own fiancé standing right there. Soleil conceded without a word of protest, his total indifference confirming what she already knew. His attention had completely migrated to Sylvia. Seeing him turn away without a second thought triggered a sharp familiar pain in her chest, forcing her to confront the painful reality of his utter abandonment. He looked upon Al with a heavy heart, terrified of dragging him into the painful spiral of her repeated fates while he stared back with eyes full of devoted concern. Determined not to cause him further distress, she listened as Al pressed her to reveal her true desires, his voice steady and sincere within the privacy of her quarters. Reaching out toward her, he pleaded for her to take his hand, a vivid memory of a past life rushing back to her in an overwhelming wave. In that forgotten life, she had accepted his offered hand and eloped with him into the night. Desperate to escape a cold world where Soleil's heart belonged entirely to Sylvia, they fled together only to be ambushed by relentless pursuers under the cover of darkness. Al fought valiantly to protect her, shielding her with his body until he was ruthlessly cut down before her eyes, leaving her to scream his name in utter agony. Ambushers enveloped her, revealing that their escape plan had been betrayed to the Marquisate from the start, declaring coldly that she would not be allowed to abandon her duties. He recalled how she had been merely his fiancée, astounded by the lengths to which they went, dispatching private intelligence units to hunt her down, proving she was far more valuable than a count's daughter. In one of her past lives, Al had sworn his absolute devotion to her, calling her his one and only mistress whose orders alone he would obey. Because he had vowed that his heart would remain with her, even when apart, she had completely misunderstood his feelings, foolishly believing that she had become his entire reason for living as Alfred's fiancée. When asked if she was aware of the other woman's existence, the painful truth emerged. Al had never mentioned her at all. Clenching her fists in regret, she realized she had been the one who never truly inquired. The woman recounted how she and Al had planned to settle down once things calmed, pitying how Alfred had pledged his loyalty only to end up dead. Hearing these words, the young noblewoman was struck by the devastating reality. Overwhelmed by remorse, she recognized that those gentle hands were never meant to protect her. She had taken his kindness for granted and grasped an outstretched hand she shouldn't have, effectively stealing Al away. High society had not taken kindly to an aristocratic lady attempting to elope, though the details of what occurred immediately following that scandal remained a total blur in her memory. Lingered most vividly was the chilling gaze of Lord Soleil, whose eyes were bitterly cold as he accused her of abandoning him despite the pained expression he wore. Doubtful that Soleil and Sylvia ever married in that timeline, she resolved that in this next iteration of her life, she would press forward entirely on her own strength. Newfound clarity and quiet determination, she readied herself to elope alone. Echoes of a strict directive weighed heavily on Ilya's mind, reminding her that there was no other alternative. Suddenly, her younger sister called out with bright enthusiasm, eager to continue the lessons from the previous day. Presenting her completed study materials with a proud smile, the younger girl confirmed that she had fully memorized yesterday's teachings just as requested. Nearby observers quietly noted how much Sylvia had changed, visiting her elder sister more frequently and taking genuine joy in every lesson provided to her. Observing this transformation, Ilya voiced her delight at such ambition, though secretly noticing just how completely different a person her sister had become. Gently reaching out to clasp her sister's hand, Sylvia admitted that she had been longing to express something important for a very long time. She confessed how in the past she felt as though she were already dead, confined to solitary walks while unable to reach out or connect with anyone around her. With tears of heartfelt gratitude in her eyes, she explained that it felt like she had been on the verge of fading away until her sister's warmth revived her spirit. Hearing these earnest words only deepened Ilya's internal guilt, knowing she was merely utilizing her sister's newly proven health and noble eligibility for her own calculated purpose. Unaware of these dark thoughts, Sylvia continued enthusiastically, envisioning a future where Lord Soleil would protect her as she stepped into the role of Duchess. Offering a radiant smile, she pledged to strive with all her heart so that her elder sister could be truly proud of the lady she was becoming. As days passed, the periods of illness grew less frequent, with each act of kindness further brightening her spirits and restoring her vitality. Even the attending physician took note of this remarkable recovery, officially diagnosing that her long bout of melancholy had finally come to an end. Observing their bond grow stronger, Soleil praised Ilya for her dedication, acknowledging how well she had cared for her younger sister. Looking at him, Ilya recognized a warm, cheerful expression he had never displayed in any of her previous lifetimes, proving the depth of his devotion to Sylvia. A picture-perfect fairy tale ending seemed destined for the bright couple. An unmistakable shadow of doubt still lingered over what was yet to come. She recalled the relentless pressure of her past, endlessly scribbling until her hands bled from the exertion. No matter how much work she completed or how tirelessly she studied, a dark voice inside continued to question her worth. Her mind had spiraled into despair as she questioned why she felt like such a complete failure, unable to find the genuine delight in learning that seemed to come so effortlessly to Sylvia. Deep down, she recognized that her desperate struggle was merely a desire to flee from the crushing burden of expectation. Under the cover of a torrential downpour, she made her escape into the dark night, slipping away from the estate and choosing to never look back. Flight from home ended disastrously when she found herself bound in heavy iron chains, placed on display to be sold. Unable to turn to her usual allies this time, she had unwisely trusted a merchant affiliated with her family, only to be betrayed and thrust into captivity. Though trafficking a noble was a severe crime, her filthy appearance and stripped possessions meant no one would ever believe her claims of aristocracy, leaving her barefoot and shackled. A wooden transport wagon rattled noisily along a secluded forest road, carrying her and several other bound captives inside its iron bars. Clenching her torn dress in anguish, she wept quietly to herself, agonizing over why such cruelty was happening to her alone. Sharp, cold voice abruptly shattered her solitude, reminding her that she was not the only sufferer. Putting her eyes, she looked over at a fellow captive sitting nearby in chains, who merely offered a cold glance before turning her head away with disdain. Harsh interaction forced a somber realization upon her, acknowledging the truth in the girl's words. She reflected on how every soul trapped within the rattling cage shared the same terrible fate of betrayal, capture, and subjugation into servitude. Yet, staring into the dark moonlit wilderness, a lingering conviction remained that her own internal torment was a unique and endless hell. Consuming thoughts of remaining hidden behind an assumed identity offered a small shield, yet harsh realities shattered any brief moments of quiet as demands for her presence were barked through the door. Dressed in simple attire, she endured crude taunts from visitors regarding her presence in such a place and how she ought to earn her keep. Having sunk to the lowest depths of the establishment, she felt crushed under the weight of countless trials, lying motionless in the gloom. Despite the relentless misery, a stubborn resolve flickered within her to endure whatever came next in order to survive and learn. Contemplating whether a meaningless existence was even worth maintaining, she recognized that her current life had descended into an absolute nightmare. Suddenly, an offering of medicine broke her painful reverie as a glass was extended toward her bed. Standing in the dim light, a young youth reassured her, softly asking if she felt well enough to rise as he delivered the remedy. Gently supporting her head, he assisted her in drinking, his presence providing an unexpected island of warmth. The unexpected arrival had brought a dedicated caretaker into her dreary surroundings, insisting she take the fluid to recover. Looking upon his pale skin and raven-dark hair, she could not help but summon vivid memories of the crow figure who haunted her past. Though his youthful form and slighter build differed greatly from the bird of her recollections, the uncanny resemblance remained striking. He urged her to sip a little more. Noticing a subtle shift in her expression, she inwardly conflated his presence with the familiar moniker of Crow. Tending to her needs, he inquired if there was anything specific she desired, even as memories of her true identity stirred deep within her. Reflecting on her decision to abandon her noble title and adopt the name Sylvia after collapsing, she realized she had never truly let go of her former self. Locking eyes with her, the young boy offered his sincere assistance, determined to help her navigate whatever troubles weighed upon her. He was not the Crow she knew, yet she acknowledged that his presence had undoubtedly brought her comfort. A realm weighed down by unending misfortune, crows had long ceased to be considered an omen of bad luck, offering little reason to expect anything from a bird wearing the guise of a young boy. Faint, gentle melody began to drift through her consciousness, stirring a sudden curiosity about who could be singing such a tender tune. Slowly fluttering her eyes open, she stirred upon the bench beside Soleil, realizing the soft sounds were real. Noticing her movement, he turned his quiet gaze toward her and asked softly if she had awakened. Panicked upon realizing she had fallen asleep right in front of Lord Soleil, She immediately began to apologize, but he calmly reassured her, noting how hard she had been working lately. Looking around the quiet surroundings under the rustling leaves, he reminded her that they were completely alone. As he murmured her name, she reflected on the melody she had just heard, a song entirely new to her, yet strikingly familiar and deeply comforting. She asked him about the song he had been humming. He explained that it was a simple lullaby, wondering if she had truly never heard it before. He admitted her uncertainty, prompting him to ask if her mother had ever sung it to her. Though she confirmed her mother had, she admitted surprised that someone like him would know a lullaby, to which he dryly reminded her that he too had been born to a mother. Gently explained that a song like that was something everyone grew up knowing, leaving her to ponder the warmth behind his words. They looked through a book together. Memories and shared promises flashed between them, talking of colors, future visits after marriage, and the modest joys of their bond. Surprising him with her sudden resolution, she looked up into his eyes and asked if they could travel and explore many distant places together. Hesitant yet moved, he gently offered his pinky finger to lock with hers, sealing the quiet promise between them as he softly spoke her name. She drifted off once more against his side. He looked down at her tenderly, whispering a gentle query if sleep had overtaken her again. Gently spoken her name, recalling the quiet promise they had bound together with linked fingers. Despite that sacred vow, he had vanished into thin air after bestowing that vivid dream, leaving her trapped alone in the deep darkness. Gasping awake from the lingering shadow of her memories, she opened her eyes to see the dark-haired youth sitting faithfully beside her bed. Before she could process his presence, the door burst open, revealing a hooded young man who cried out to her in panicked distress. Overwhelmed with grief at the sight of her fragile condition, the blonde intruder rushed to her bedside, weeping bitterly. Gently lifted her frail body into a protective embrace, begging to take her home while she felt a strange nostalgic warmth in his arms. Recognizing the familiar golden locks framing his face, she realized it was Al, who wept uncontrollably as he begged for forgiveness for taking so long to arrive. As he held her close like the tearful boy from her past, a quiet despair settled in her heart, knowing that the home he offered no longer existed for her. Raven-haired companion interjected with a cold, dry quip, cutting through the emotional reunion and drawing Al's bewildered gaze. Ignoring the dark youth's sarcasm, Al stood firm and vowed to restore everything she had lost and return her life to the way it once was. Desperate to break away, she pleaded with Al to stop and put her down, insisting that she had no desire to leave. She realized with growing unease that she had never disclosed her location to Al, having only sought Crow's aid to accept her grim reality. Looking at her enigmatic guardian, she felt that anywhere would be acceptable as long as he remained at her side. Lone Dark Feather lay quietly on the ground, a silent testament to her hope that he would stay with her until her final consciousness slowly returned in the dim room. Soft murmurs echoed near the bedside, calling out her name and asking if she was awake. In her fogged mind, she could only softly whisper back, searching for Crow. Reaching out into the shadow-draped darkness, her weak hand grasped at nothing as she quietly questioned where he had gone. Taking in her luxurious surroundings, the soft sheets beneath her and the crisp, fresh air, she realized this could not be her home. Beside her, Marianne leaned in with relief, relieved to see her awake and asking if it truly was her older sister. Her vision remained hazy. She could sense the worried expression wearing on the silhouette standing over her bed. Apologizing for causing such distress, she harbored a quiet wish to rest forever as her end drew near, while her sister gently insisted on listening to whatever she needed to say. Leaning in closer, the young girl asked tenderly if she was in pain, if the suffering was too difficult to endure, and if there was anything she could do to help. In her chest, a painful and bitter ache lingered. She had once longed for someone to truly understand her feelings, but she had abandoned that hope, her thoughts drifting back to Crow. Reflecting on her past confinement, she remembered the one person who had looked upon her without disgust or pity, recalling how she had sought only to prove her own worth to others. Her sister's gentle voice broke through her reverie, asking if she could hear her. Memories surfaced of Soleil sitting by her side and what he had truly desired. Looking upon the noble young man whose gaze met hers, she remembered his quiet, serious tone, calling out to her. Deep down, her long-held secret remained absolute. She had always despised him. Nobleman confronted her bitterly, reminding her of their childhood bond and engagement, questioning how she could disappear without a word and hurt him by claiming to love another. Recalling how she had confidingly spoken to her sister about doing anything for the person she loved, he demanded to know why she had lacked the trust to confide her struggles in him directly. He coldly responded that her departure was precisely because what she felt for him was never love, accusing him of shattering any remaining hope for their future friendship. He recalled how he had left her behind, abandoning her to endure the hardship alone as a punishment for running away. Even though he had betrayed her repeatedly across lives, she acknowledged that she too had betrayed him, yet part of her remained inexplicably grateful for his past attempts to act as a proper fiancé. Images of Soleil finding happiness with Sylvia and raising children together flashed through her mind, but her heart longed only for Crow, wondering why he was not by her side. She remembered how Crow had gazed at her with immense tenderness, while she secretly wished for death, surrounded by the desperate cries of those around her. Looking around her quiet chamber, she realized with quiet certainty that everything she had truly desired was right there in that room. What felt like her final moments, her only wish had been to reach out and touch Crow's soft dark hair. Memories shifted to past aristocratic gatherings where onlookers' whispers filled the air, claiming that Sylvia was far more suited to Lord Soleil than Lady Ilya ever could be. Others praised Soleil and Sylvia as a picture-perfect couple. She sat alone with her teacup, visibly distracted and pale, prompting concerned inquiries about her health. As background gossip gossip criticized her delicate health and lack of etiquette, a gentle companion leaned in closer, noticing the tears brimming in her eyes, and asked whether she truly loved Lord Soleil. She confessed that she had indeed fallen for him from the very first moment they met, though something deep within her had begun to shift. Standing in silence, she acknowledged the profound transformation in her heart, realizing that her feelings were no longer what they once were. Upon awakening each morning, she reminded herself of her true identity, grounding her thoughts before opening her eyes to face the day's obligations, only to learn that a letter from the Marquis had just arrived. Message requested a lunch visit from Lord Soleil, prompting her attendant to immediately arrange preparations for his arrival. Realizing the short notice left her no time to decline, she instructed her maid to let her change closer to noon, opting to spend her morning in the mansion's quiet library. The attendant mentioned that the Marquis also requested her sister join them if she was feeling well. The young noblewoman reached high up onto the library shelves for a book. Approaching her side, the young guard gently offered to retrieve the high volumes for her, inquiring about what specific topic she was so intently searching for. She struggled to put her search into words, acknowledging that she was seeking answers about a subject she could not yet fully comprehend. Mind drifted back to the mysterious figure who could shift forms between a bird, a cat, and a human, realizing how extraordinary and unique his existence truly was. Paging through dense volumes on history and lore, she hoped to find any historical record of a human possessing such uncanny magical abilities. Observing her quiet determination, the guard pressed further, questioning why she was devoting so much effort to researching something so unknown. Deep down, her true motivation was simple and clear. Above all else, she merely wished to see him once again. While explaining her methodical strategy of gathering clues to the skeptical guard, her sister's cheerful voice echoed down the hallway, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the library. Turning around, she discovered her sister arriving alongside Lord Soleil, who had arrived earlier than expected. Her sister brightly explained that they had been keeping each other company in the guest room while waiting for lunch. They walked together toward the dining room. Conversation turned to her simple attire, though she quietly resolved to change into a proper dress to greet their guest formally. She stood quietly as the conversation unfolded, listening to the pleasantries exchanged regarding tea service and propriety within the mansion. Turning his attention back to her, Lord Soleil pointed out that since the mansion staff was discreet, they did not need to be so excessively guarded. Pressed further, reminding her of her noble standing and questioning why she continued to act with such restraint despite knowing the truth. As the debate continued around her, arguments were raised regarding fairness and who held the ultimate authority to make decisions within their family arrangement. Preparing to take his leave, Lord Soleil turned away, but she called out to stop him before he could depart. Pausing in his tracks, he turned back to look at her, waiting to hear what she had to say. At that moment, Al approached them with documents in hand, interrupting the quiet standoff between the two. Lord Soleil directly asked her if she truly was content with the situation, wondering if she had any unspoken thoughts she was holding back. Looking closely at her, he remarked that somehow she seemed to have changed from how she used to be. After he departed with Al, she was left behind in the hallway, reflecting on the lingering impact of his parting words. She internally struggled with her emotions, knowing that no matter what expression she wore, her true feelings were destined to be overlooked. Reflecting on her appearance, she considered how every detail of her dress, hair, and accessories was constantly compared to her sister's bright presence. Memory drifted back to childhood, remembering how praise was always showered upon her sister while her own efforts went completely unnoticed. In those quiet past moments, only one mysterious figure had ever truly noticed her and spoken directly to her with genuine attention. Sitting together in the dimly lit room, Crow gently observed the unique beauty of her dark hair, offering words of recognition that stayed with her forever. Mind drifted back to the comforting words spoken to her in the past, reminding her that the gentle shadow cast upon the snow made the winter landscape far more beautiful than a plain white field. His fingers gently brushed her dark hair. The youth had softly insisted that regardless of her hair color, facial features, or true self, she remained an undeniable part of that delicate beauty. He promised to always see her as gorgeous, leaving her to ponder how he could offer such validation when he was unaware of her constant, painful comparisons to Sylvia. Even when others like Lord Simon offered quiet reassurances about Soleil's academy friends as Sylvia grew closer to him, it was always the dark-haired youth who spoke the exact words her heart longed to hear. Sylvia seemed strangely familiar with him despite no formal introductions. The young woman had spent her days hoping every opening door would reveal the black bird waiting on her couch, just as he had on the day he called her a captured princess. Looking back, she wondered where Crow could be now, knowing that in a world stripped of hope, he had been the sole presence to grant her the strength she so desperately needed. Reflecting on her past, Ilya recalled how her mother treasured Sylvia as an adorable princess, showering her with affection despite them being only half-sisters. She had longed for that same motherly love. She had kept her desires buried deep inside, believing any affection given to her would stem merely from a sense of obligation. Hesitant to reach out to her own mother, she had gradually constructed an impenetrable emotional wall around herself. When she was first imprisoned, her parents had turned their backs on her entirely, leaving her to ponder the true depth of their abandonment. She realized then that they had not simply cast her aside in favor of her sister, but rather that a rift had been widening between them for a very long time. Sitting alone on a quiet outdoor bench with a small basket of food in hand, she sought a moment of quiet solitude away from the crowd. Suddenly, the crunch of approaching footsteps shattered the quiet, causing her to glance up up in mild surprise. Alfred approached with an easy smile, asking if she was having lunch in such a secluded spot and politely requesting permission to sit beside her. Maintaining her dignity as a nobleman's daughter, she politely declined, explaining that it would be inappropriate to be alone with a man who was not her fiancé. Observing his refined bearing, she recognized him as a high-ranking noble visiting from another country, someone she had previously seen conversing with Soleil. With an unwavering, pleasant expression, he apologized for disturbing her, prompting her to attempt a polite exit under the guise of returning to class. Casually cut off her departure, pointing out that she had not even eaten yet, and insisting there was no need to rush. Addressing her directly by her full noble title, Ilya Lear Matisse, he asked if she could grant him a little more of her time. Shocked that he knew her true identity and her engagement from the start, she struggled to maintain her composure while realizing that beneath his charming facade lay a sharp, predatory mind much like her own. With an astute gaze hidden behind a persistent smile, he pressed directly to the heart of the matter, asking if she was sitting alone because Soleil was currently in the cafeteria accompanied by her younger sister. He confirms his assessment quietly, admitting that he is entirely correct in his observation, while subtly pivoting the topic of their conversation. He goes on to explain that Soleil has been taking extraordinary care of her little sister, admitting that she herself has been spoiled by his generosity, though she simply sought a moment of quiet solitude to catch her breath. Continuing her explanation, she notes that while she was originally meant to guide her sister, the girl adores Soleil as an elder brother, prompting to entrust her sister to his care out of concern that she might grow anxious without company. Ponders the term brother with a quiet amusement, realizing that his suspicions regarding the closeness between Soleil and Sylvia have led him to question her, his fiancée. Acknowledges how easily such excuses come to mind, questioning whether others truly view the situation in the same light. He turns her gaze away, musing inwardly that she cannot be entirely certain of anyone else's thoughts on the matter. With a soft sigh, he remarks on how different she seems from the impression he had formed, noting that in the past he might have raised his voice. Though he asks if she intends to depart anytime soon. She prepares to stand, he halts her movement, asserting that he is not yet finished speaking and suggesting they properly introduce themselves. He introduces himself as Scion Topius from a neighboring country, noting with a polite smile that omitting one's surname would be quite rude in a formal setting. He pauses in surprise, questioning why he referred to himself as Scion, while wondering if there is a hidden significance behind concealing his true family name. Observing the close rapport between the two, he displays a pleasing expression, subtly revealing that this was precisely the reaction he wished to witness. He elaborates on his origins, describing how political marriages are gradually being viewed as an outdated practice in his homeland, despite remaining prevalent among older generations. Notes that even with those traditional beliefs, his country possesses a deeper understanding of love-based unions. Turning the conversation directly back to her, he observes how her entire demeanor suddenly shifted, pressing her with the bold question of whether she truly loves Soleil. Calling the recent tea party where all eyes were fixed on him, she wrestled with her inner turmoil, urging herself not to let go of what truly matters. He stood motionless as he leaned in close, whispering his subtle provocation directly into her ear. Stunned into silence, her mind struggled to process his intense proximity as she silently urged him to let go. Turning away, the young noble began to step into the distance, leaving her isolated with the realization that he was truly someone who longed for such a drastic outcome. Memories surfaced of a time when gifts were received from their father, contrasting the affection shown to Sylvia with the treatment given to Ilya. Intended gift was a rare, precious jewel to mark Sylvia's debut, while Ilya received only a hand-drawn portrait by their father, compelling her to offer polite congratulations. Looking at the sparkling necklace, Sylvia expressed soft envy, prompting Ilya to wonder if her own hand-drawn portrait was displeasing, only for their father to apologize stiffly. Summoned later to her father's study, Ilya received orders to fetch a jewel matching her sister's eyes, enduring harsh words spoken without a single glance. It became clear that what she truly desired was never an expensive necklace for high society, but simply something genuine, a sentiment that faded as she wrote at her desk, quietly working by candlelight in her library late at night. A dark question lingered in her mind regarding why love seemed so withheld. Someone from another lifetime had once posited that just as love requires no reason, perhaps the absence of love requires none either. Standing by her desk, the shadowy youth noted how people constantly seek justifications for why they feel the way they do. Observed with a subtle, calm smile that individuals only find relief when they can attribute a cause to their internal emotions. Creating logic for inherent feelings seemed like an amusing human flaw. Looking at her with dark, questioning eyes that doubted the entire world, he questioned whether a reason was needed for being unloved or loved, uttering her name softly. Pointed out that if love had no reason, then everything she had been doing would be utterly meaningless. A remarkably human expression that surprised her. Heart thrummed heavily as she sat alone at her desk, acutely aware that pondering such futility was in vain, yet unable to stop. Sudden pulse raced through her chest as she realized she had indeed held that exact conversation in this room, wondering why the memories suddenly resurfaced. Clenching her hand tightly, she questioned why those vivid recollections were completely absent until this exact moment. She had always believed herself incapable of forgetting love, yet her past memories had somehow become a blur. Recollections of Marianne reading romantic literature surfaced in her mind, revealing critical details she had previously overlooked. Smiling gently, the younger girl had summarized a novel depicting a scandalously passionate affair between a knight and a princess. Though Marianne criticized the story as a fever dream lacking realism, she still conceded its charm. Its pragmatic assessment led her to view Marianne as a grounded realist who harbored no childish fantasies. And asked if a classic happy ending was flawed, she had reassured Marianne that nothing was wrong with it. Marianne probed deeper, questioning whether a princess fleeing her kingdom with a common knight genuinely constituted happiness. He pointed out the stark political reality that both individuals likely had pre-existing betrothals. Reflecting on their shared status, she realized Marianne viewed the tale through the lens of her own arranged political marriage. However, unlike her own solitary circumstances, Marianne was genuinely cherished by her fiancé, rendering her life like a fantasy. Observing how Marianne conveniently overlooked harsh truths, she decided it was time to end their conversation and depart. Before she could leave, Marianne offered a graceful compliment regarding noble beauty and elegance. Clapping her hands softly, Marianne expressed sympathy for the immense pressure that came with high aristocratic duties. Acknowledging the girl's concealed struggles, she silently recognized the sheer effort hidden beneath that cheerful demeanor. Looking at Marianne, an unyielding resolve hardened within her heart to never allow her companion's existence to be erased. She reflected on how, in past lives, she might have readily grasped Marianne's offered hands and sought her assistance. Yet now, holding Marianne's hands firmly, she assured the younger girl that if there were ever anything she needed, she should not hesitate to ask for help. Though taking her hand in previous iterations might have brought her closer to Salih's heart, her current self offered a serene, resolute smile, assuring Marianne that there was no need to worry because she was entirely all right. Mind drifted back to their childhood days, remembering how he would always walk more slowly, patiently waiting for her as she followed behind. Even when no words were spoken, his gentle gaze seemed to convey a comforting promise that everything was bound to be all right no matter what occurred. She had repeatedly told herself that everything was fine, striving to hold on to those old feelings. Yet now, whatever emotions Salih once evoked in her have completely faded, leaving his comforting words stripped of all their former meaning. Sitting amid the mess on the carpet, the young noblewoman looked down at her ink-stained dress as an elderly attendant rushed to her side in utter distress. Calmly downplaying the accident, she explained that she had simply spilled ink over herself. Excusing herself to handle the situation discreetly, the servant stepped out of the room. Watching her leave, the young lady reasoned that the maid was likely attempting to prevent any other household staff from witnessing her unseemly state. As dark ink pooled across the floor beside the overturned bottle, she reflected on the consequences of being seen, knowing well that any loose-lipped servant witnessing her in such a pathetic state would spread endless rumors throughout the estate. Left alone in the quiet chamber, she gently inquired about the whereabouts of Alfred. Senior attendant informed her that Sir Alfred was away from the mansion running an errand. The realization hit her with a sudden gasp, making her instantly regret her habit of calling for him. Recognizing that summoning a male companion in a compromised situation was improper, she admitted that because he was the one who usually checked on her, she had spoken out of habit. Softening her tone, she asked the maid not to look at her so judgmentally, expressing genuine gratitude for her presence. The woman standing before her was Marge, a senior maid who had served as her dedicated personal attendant ever since her betrothal to Salih was announced. Over time, a subtle shift had occurred, as Marge gradually drifted away from her. The turning point came when she noticed Marge taking up position as Sylvia's personal attendant instead. Despite raising a complaint to her mother about the betrayal, she was merely admonished to show restraint and be considerate of Sylvia. Looking back, she realized she had already lost Marge's allegiance long before the fateful tea party. She recalled a past moment when Marge had expressed concern over her ashen appearance while carefully wiping the ink stains from her hands. Turning to the present, she decided that taking a warm bath would be best. As Marge reached for a dusty cloth nearby to wipe her ink-covered hands, she immediately interjected, warning her servant that such a soiled rag should not be used on her hands. Addressing the spilled bottle on the floor, she offered a polite apology for causing such a troublesome mess. Insisting that there was no need for her lady to apologize over something so trivial, the maid offered to prepare a hot bath right away. As Marge turned to leave, a slip of the tongue escaped her lips as she muttered about a memory. Catching the strange remark, the young lady immediately questioned her, refusing to let the comment pass. Caught off guard, the elderly servant froze in surprise, wringing her hands nervously as she tried to brush it off. But the young lady firmly demanded that Marge stop dodging the question. She stood motionless as Marge admitted to having assumed her mistress would have forgotten her name after so long, even while memories of Marge calling out to her echoed faintly from the past. Even though they had spent so much time together, the distant days of childhood companionship felt remarkably far away. Realizing that Marge likely assumed her name remained forgotten, the young noblewoman reflected on whether that very misunderstanding was the reason her maid had aligned herself with Sylvia. Softening her expression, she gently offered her gratitude, thanking Marge for always treating her so kindly despite everything. Yet deep within her heart, the sharp sting of betrayal lingered, knowing the choice had ultimately been made to cut her ties. Later, while soaking in a warm bath, water droplets fell rhythmically from above, echoing the quiet melancholy of her solitude. Listening to the slow dripping sound, she was reminded of cold rain, running her hands through the water in deep contemplation. Memory of past collapse washed over her, recalling how she had once collapsed helplessly onto the cold floor in desperate anguish. She wondered back then whether her suffering had stemmed from an illness, a severe injury, or if she had done it to herself. Faced with unbearable pain in that forgotten moment, she had desperately wished to abandon her broken body and escape somewhere peaceful, pleading silently to be saved. Even knowing that no one was listening, She had begged whatever god might exist somewhere out there to let her desperate plea reach them. Single quiet affirmation had answered her silent plea. Shadowy memories flooded back of a mysterious figure who had remained by her side through the darkness, endlessly waiting for her. Looking at the youth who held her, she realized there was a vital truth she needed to understand, the real reason why she had not been loved. Reflecting on his words from another life, she remembered his claim that affection needed no justification. Yet now she finally understood the true reason her parents had abandoned her in favor of Sylvia. She held the dark-haired youth tightly, whispering soft words of comfort to assure him that everything was all right, and that his suffering had finally come to an end. Deep within her heart, she recognized that those gentle words were what she had always longed to hear herself as she sank beneath the quiet surface. Submerged in the bathwater, her lungs burned with a desperate lack of air until sudden shouts broke through the silence and panic erupted across the household. Coughing violently after being pulled from the tub, she chastised herself for such an embarrassing mistake, knowing that a future marchioness was expected to safeguard her health regardless of her desire to conceal the ink on her skin. Ignoring the flustered protests of the attending maids, Sir Alfred burst into the room and immediately draped a warm, protective towel over her shivering shoulders. Sharply questioned why she had been left unattended in the bath, brushing aside her quiet defense that she had commanded the staff to leave her alone. Expressing his disappointment in the servants for blindly obeying orders that compromised her well-being, he gently dismissed her attempt to take responsibility and offered to escort her to her bedchamber. Accepting his offer, she turned to comfort her weeping maid, softly assuring the tearful girl that there was no need to ask for forgiveness. Lamenting her own clumsiness for spilling ink and nearly drowning, she let out a weary sigh while the maid looked on, moved by her mistress's unwavering kindness. The servant tearfully asked why she had not been reprimanded for her negligence. The young noblewoman reflected on how her mother had shaped her to treat others with gentle restraint. She remembered the stern directive to conduct herself as a proper lady at all times, quietly questioning whether her efforts had ever truly been enough. Later that evening, her mother entered the chamber with a cold, composed posture, noting the report of the bath incident and inquiring if her daughter felt unwell. Small glimmer of hope arose that her mother might care for her, only to be crushed when the matriarch clarified that managing Sylvia was already exhausting enough without further disruptions. Fixing her daughter with a distant, unyielding gaze, her mother uttered her name with deliberate detachment. Painful coldness brought back a bitter childhood memory of being held in an embrace, only to be told that she would never be pampered again. She reflected on her distant relationship with her mother, knowing that as Soleil's betrothed, she could no longer afford to be coddled even if her mother had briefly pretended otherwise. Standing by her bedside, Sir Alfred offered his deepest apologies for what had transpired. Looking up at him from her bed, she asked why everyone around her was constantly apologizing, wondering if they all held her in such pitying regard. Caught off guard by her candid question, the young knight struggled for words before bowing his head to apologize once more. She inquired whether he had been the one to inform her mother of the incident. When he clarified that it was Marge who had done so, expressing regret that he hadn't stopped her, she softly reassured him that it was fine. He reasoned that Marge had only acted out of kindness, believing her mother would do everything possible to help her child. Deep down, she acknowledged that her mother truly was a noble woman who cherished her family, even if distance remained between them. Reaching her hand outward, she addressed the knight once more. He asked if he would hold her hand, a simple gesture that stirred memories of one of her past lives. The sudden request left the knight startled and hesitant, unsure of how to respond. Ultimately, he chose not to take her offered hand. Watching his restraint, she let out a gentle chuckle, admitting she had simply wanted to see what would happen when she asked. A part of her wished she could seal away her heart to avoid feeling unloved. She knew she could not escape the pain. Instead, she asked if he would listen to her story, the complete truth about herself, Sylvia, and their parents. With quiet devotion, the knight promised that this is the story of a girl who has spent her entire life completely unloved, standing in the shadows of her own world. Sitting upon her bed, she softly calls out to Alfred, asking if he truly understands the reality of their situation. He points out that Sylvia is akin to a princess, a statement Alfred quietly confirms as he stands attentively at her bedside. Clarifying her words, she emphasizes that it isn't merely a metaphor. Sylvia is treated like a genuine, radiant princess in every sense of the word. Reflecting on their place in this world, she muses that while every story revolves around its own central protagonist, she herself is merely a secondary character existing on the periphery. Looking down at a dark book resting on the bed, she wonders aloud what genre her own bizarre life would even fall under if compared to literature. She inquires if Alfred is familiar with the popular novel, to which he confirms that he has indeed heard of it. Holding the volume, she questions what lesson could possibly be drawn from a cliché romance where a commoner and a nobleman overcome all odds to be together. He recognizes the book as belonging to the master. She calmly reveals a startling truth. She stole it directly from her father's collection. Amused by his stunned reaction, she breaks into soft laughter, teasingly asking him not to tease her while he struggles for words. Ponders the double standard of her father, knowing that if Sylvia had taken the book, her father would have laughed it off fondly, whereas any other child would face severe punishment. Calling events from some time ago, she remembers visiting her father's estate for territorial advice shortly after her marriage, only to find he had left for a suburban villa to care for Sylvia. Driven by an inexplicable urge and reasoning that it was all for Sylvia's sake, she found herself walking down the quiet hallways toward her father's private study. Subconsciously reaching out, her hand closed around the metallic door handle of the study. To her surprise, the door clicked and swung open effortlessly, unlocked despite normally requiring a key, granting her entry into the dim room. She stood surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, reflecting on how improbable it was that she had stumbled upon a specific hidden location, a place she normally would never have searched. Apologizing softly to Al, she pondered why she had been so strangely drawn to looking there in the first place. Because she could offer no clear explanation, she admitted it might have been mere coincidence or an unseen force driving her. Realizing he had pressed too far, her companion quickly offered an apology, acknowledging that he had overstepped his boundaries. Sitting upon the plush bed, she quietly uttered Al's name while holding the mysterious volume in her hands, turned the pages diligently until she instructed him to flip to the very last page of the book. Surprised by what he discovered written at the end, he gasped as her eyes widened in realization. For them was an illustration depicting a beautiful, light-haired young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Lady Sylvia. Examining the portrait, he clarified that whenever his master finished a drawing, he would add his signature and the date, noting that this particular artwork was created well before Sylvia was even born. Pondered whether this mystery woman could be Sylvia's biological mother, considering it was widely known that they shared different mothers, though almost no one actually knew what her mother looked like. Continuing their discussion, he observed the girl's stunning likeness to Sylvia. She explained that, driven by that very question, she had pulled strings to contact the book's author, only to receive cold, definitive answers. Presented to the world as a fictional romance between a mid-ranking noble and a princess, the true figures behind the story were none other than her own father and his royal love. She realized that if she disclosed the full truth now, it could drastically alter their future path, leaving him looking on attentively as she pondered her options. Dark thoughts surfaced in her mind, declaring how pitiful Alfred's unyielding loyalty to her truly was. Sudden knock at the door broke the tense silence, prompting him to address her as the unexpected visitor arrived. Carefully closing the volume, he suggested that they set the matter aside and resume their discussion at a later time. She reflected privately on her total trust in him, knowing he was the only remaining person she could fully rely on, yet resolving not to show weakness or cling to him. Sylvia entered the room alongside her companion, offering a special decoction while expressing concern over the recent near-drowning incident in the bath. He listened quietly as Sylvia giggled softly, playfully admitting the brew tasted dreadful while begging her to keep it a secret from her mother. Offering a faint, polite response, she simply voiced her gratitude. Gaze darkened into a distant stare until a pair of delicate hands reached out to envelop her own. Startled by the sudden touch, she looked toward Sylvia in quiet surprise. Sylvia offered a hesitant apology, explaining that she had only reached out because she noticed her looking terribly cold. Sitting close beside her on the bed, Sylvia held her hands with gentle concern while she remained silent, staring down at their joined fingers. Looking up with soft, affectionate eyes, Sylvia squeezed her hands firmly, offering comfort through her touch. Sensation was undeniably warm, yet a dark realization settled deep within her chest. These were the very hands that had stripped away everything she held dear. Though those hands had once offered solace and protection, the lingering specter of Crow seemed to mock her from the shadows, questioning if such a simple act of warmth could so easily earn her total forgiveness. Standing in the arched corridor of the academy, Ilya found herself approached by Soleil, who stiffly suggested they share a meal together sometime. Though his facial expression remained cold and distant as whispers echoed from onlookers around them, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable receiving such a sudden invitation. He realized that rejecting him publicly would cause the heir to a Marcus to lose face, especially as whispers questioned if she was indeed his rumored fiancée. Noticing the intense gaze of Siontopius fixed upon her, she offered a polite bow, formally introducing herself as Ilya Lear-Matisse. Carefully measuring her words, she acknowledged his presence with deference, knowing that introducing herself first reflected her lower social standing compared to a high-ranking foreign noble. While Sion introduced himself casually, she pondered his aloof mannerisms, determined not to bring shame upon Soleil's family by acting inappropriately. Suddenly, an unexpected movement caught her eye, breaking the tense silence between the three of them. Soleil casually dismissed the distraction and suggested they head off to lunch. She wondered if Sion had been watching her just moments prior. Walking beside him down the hall, she quietly kept pace while reflecting on how different things used to be between them. In the past, he would wait patiently without rushing her, but those gentle days were now long gone. Stepping into the bustling cafeteria filled with chatter, he brought up a new question regarding her daily routine. Inquiring about where she usually ate since he rarely saw her around, Sion pressed to know if she dined with friends or spent her time elsewhere. She quietly admitted to eating by herself. She sensed that he already knew the answer before asking. Chastising herself internally for being foolish, she faltered under the weight of their probing conversation. As Soleil suggested they eat together whenever their schedules allowed, her heart couldn't help but leap with foolish hope at his sudden interest. She stood frozen in stunned silence, wondering if her ears had deceived her or if he had simply misspoke, feeling an unmistakable sense of lingering tension between them. Observing their hesitation, Sion remarked that despite being engaged, they still seemed as distant as complete strangers, a point he conceded was entirely valid. Softly addressing her as Ilya, he quietly waited for an answer to his invitation, while she inwardly realized that she was the one unaccustomed to such intimacy. Reasoning that she had no grounds to turn down an arrangement that benefited them both, she convinced herself that this was merely how betrayal betrothed couples were expected to behave. Interjecting cheerfully, Xian proposed inviting Lady Sylvia as well, so long as his own sister remained uninvolved. Unexpected suggestion immediately caught her off guard, sending a sudden ripple of shock through her posture. Studying the young man carefully, she detected no outward malice, yet she could distinctly tell he was maintaining a calculated facade. Recognizing the familiar games of high society, she understood that behind his polite smile, he was actively seeking to probe and ascertain her true thoughts. With effortless compliance, Soleil agreed to extend the invitation to Sylvia, leaving her with no choice but to acquiesce if she wished to remain a supportive elder sister. Overwhelming urge to flee washed over her as time seemed to press heavily upon her chest, despite having gone through the motions of regression and promises. Inner turmoil was abruptly shattered when Sylvia suddenly appeared, calling out to Lord Soleil as she hurried toward them. Flustered and breathless, Sylvia stammered about hearing rumors of their dining together, desperately trying to conceal her feelings of being excluded from their world. Watching the pair from a distance, she felt as though they inhabited an entirely separate realm where she had no right to intervene. She observed them conversing over tea. She resigned herself to the bitter realization that she was not even a supporting character, but merely an invisible bystander in their story. Sylvia beamed with delight while admiring Lord Soleil's expression, leaving her to silently spectate their warm interaction from the sidelines. He looks on silently as the surrounding admiration centers on Sylvia, whose charming nature naturally draws people toward her and makes others instinctively want to protect her. However, Sylvia mentions that she was fortunately accompanied by her elder sister just moments before. Observing the exchange, she realizes with a quiet sense of detachment that she is not someone others feel the need to look out for. The topic shifts and Sylvia is asked how she is feeling. The young woman stammers in hesitation, startled by the sudden question. She worries internally that her choice of words was poor, realizing Sylvia is likely more concerned about the previous night's events than her own well-being. Sylvia apologizes sincerely, yet the conversation grows tense as others inquire whether something confidential occurred between them. Seeing Sylvia's distress, Sion steps in to ease the mood, urging her not to apologize or make such an anxious expression, while Ilya watches silently, wondering why this unfolding dynamic feels so heavy. He considers whether her own stern facial expression was unpleasant to them, causing them to assume she was glaring, while Sylvia stammers out another gentle apology. The calm yet firm tone, she asks the group not to bother Sylvia too much about the matter. Reflecting on how troubled Sylvia looked, she realizes she instinctively tried to step in and cover for her sister. Standing quietly, she recognizes that despite her intention to protect Sylvia, it only serves to reinforce the harsh rumors that she herself is fierce and cold. Soleil quietly observes the room, aware of the subtle malice directed toward her malice, that others remain completely oblivious. As they walked together through the courtyard, onlookers whispered about how rarely the two sisters were seen side by side, wondering why they never seemed to align. Reflecting on her former self, she quietly apologized, acknowledging how she had once been consumed by petty jealousy and resentment. She assured her sister that she truly did not mind the past, urging her not to dwell on it either. Looking up with gentle affection, her sister expressed deep gratitude, holding her elder sibling in the highest regard. Deep down, dark questions resurfaced. She couldn't help but ponder why her sister had ultimately betrayed her trust after everything. She acknowledged the lingering bitterness within her heart, recognizing that part of her was still flawed and resentful. Muddled emotions swirled inside her as she recalled giving all her knowledge to the very person who ultimately sealed her tragic fate. Countless memories and painful cycles of profound emptiness settled over her, forcing her to accept that she had no choice but to let go. Echoing voice from her past berated her as a fool, though she could not quite place whose voice it was that mocked her. Lost in her thoughts, her foot missed the step on the stone staircase, sending her tumbling forward unexpectedly. Gravity took hold and she plummeted downward, her hands reached out helplessly into empty air. Suddenly, a firm grip snatched her sleeve, forcefully yanking her back toward safety before she hit the steps. Breathing heavily, she steadied herself and turned around, eager to offer her heartfelt gratitude to whoever had caught her. She began to express her thanks. She paused upon recognizing the young man stand before her. She identified his distinctive reddish-brown hair and realized he was Lord Soleil's close friend, a noble who had always observed her from a distance. Caught her off guard as she attempted to politely excuse herself, calling out insistently for her to wait. His sudden intervention startled her, as his demeanor toward her had never once felt friendly. Turning back toward him with a puzzled expression, she waited quietly while he hesitated, visibly searching for the right words to speak. Asked if she was feeling unwell, an inquiry that caught her unprepared and stirred painful memories of her wedding day with Soleil. When praise was showered upon Sylvia while she herself received not a single kind word, he rationalized that he was merely relaying concern on Soleil's behalf, as Soleil could not openly show consideration for another woman in front of his new bride. She continued to question why he would care about her well-being at all, knowing that to him she was supposed to be nothing more than an obstacle. Though she managed to reply that she was fine, his persistent concern made her reflect on her condition, realizing she might indeed be feeling under the weather. Cruel, distant echoes began to reverberate in her mind, taunting her mercilessly. Cold memory resurfaced of a harsh voice mocking her miserable state, ridiculing her for continuing to put her faith in Soleil while in prison. Clutching her painful, bruised body against cold iron bars, she remembered being told bluntly that Soleil would never come to save her. Overwhelmed by intense suffering on the brink of death, she had wondered why that harsh speaker kept stabbing her with sharp words, calling her a fool who could never defy fate. Stern voice had insisted that Soleil and Sylvia were destined for each other, declaring that there was simply no way to break that bond. Lapsed upon the frigid stone floor of her cell, she had been made to believe that every effort she had ever put forth was completely and utterly useless. Despite the harshness of those words, a faint memory insisted that his voice back then had unexpectedly carried a deep undertone of compassion. Snapping back to the present moment, she tried to understand his true motives, but he interrupted her thoughts, noting with deep worry how pale she had suddenly turned. Fear gripped her heart as she realized that beyond that single encounter in the prison, they had never interacted before, leaving her terrified as to why he was standing right before her now. She had believed her final moments in her past life were long forgotten, but suddenly every memory came rushing back in an instant. Noticing her sudden change in demeanor, Alfred voiced his concern, feeling that something within the atmosphere was shifting. He recalled how he had spoken to her in that prison cell, chuckling softly despite the grim surroundings. Beneath that faint laugh, tears had streamed down his face. Her memories, his whisper echoed into the darkness as he begged for her forgiveness. He had first visited her after her imprisonment. She assumed he had come merely to mock her, believing a high-ranking noble would never step into such a filthy place unless it was to gloat or torment a fallen criminal. Enter a restricted prison, he must have spent a considerable fortune bribing the guards, a desperate act whose true motivation still eluded her comprehension. Reflecting on his sorrowful expression, a shocking realization began to dawn upon her mind. She wondered if he had known all along that she was falsely accused, knowing that her previous downfall only occurred after Sylvia's death when someone took advantage of the tragedy to frame her. Contemplating her inevitable fate of being stripped of everything, she questioned whether her current choices were truly her own or merely illusions of a predetermined destiny. Returning to the estate early in the day after feeling unwell, the young noblewoman was greeted attentively by her loyal knight, Al, who noticed her distress. As they walked together, Al observed her subdued demeanor, silently reflecting on her recent burdens. He expressed his concern, acknowledging that while leaving in the middle of the day was unusual, he could see how hard she had been working lately. Though she appreciated his concern, she urged him not to worry and suggested he attend to his own duties instead of escorting her to her room. Yet, looking at his earnest face, she privately admitted that despite all her efforts, her hard work felt entirely in vain. Offering a soothing gesture, Al asked if she would like some tea before resting, bringing up the tea leaves Sylvia had gifted her. He contemplated the gift, realizing these herb-infused leaves were personally prepared by her mother specifically for Sylvia's health. Bitter realization struck her. Her mother had never once blended tea leaves for her, not in the past and not now. Noticing her sudden silence, Al asked if he sounded resentful by chance, explaining that a merchant with family ties had managed to source those rare leaves. Turning to face her directly, he promised to bring those special tea leaves for her next time. He recalled Sylvia's cheerful acceptance of her mother's actions, remembering how Sylvia insisted that gifts from parents should simply be accepted with gratitude. Seeing how lovingly her mother treated Sylvia, she forced herself to swallow the envious words rising in her throat. Alone in her dimly lit bedchamber, she sat upon the edge of her mattress, overwhelmed by isolation. Holding the small glass jar, she admired the delicate ribbon Sylvia had tied around it as a gift. Uncorking the jar, she repeatedly reminded herself that the innocent girl was not at fault, chanting the thought like a protective spell. She gently unsealed the small jar, taking in the soft floral scent that drifted into the air. The delicate aroma felt surprisingly cleansing, carrying a subtle sour note that triggered a strange, lingering sense of nostalgia deep within her. Suddenly, a sharp cough racked her chest, forcing her to stoop over as she caught her breath. Dismissing the reaction, she brushed it off as a simple dust particle or a harmless tickle in her throat. The quiet solitude of her room, a distant memory resurfaced. She mused that if she were entirely alone in the world, she could neither cause harm nor be hurt by others, much like those isolated days spent in the cramped room of the brothel. Yet a moment of clarity reminded her that she had not truly been alone during those dark times. She vividly recalled the dark-haired youth sitting beside her bed, offering her daily medicine, his voice gently calling her name as her eyes widened at the recollection. The image of the traveling doctor came back to her next, recalling how he had assessed her fragile condition and prescribed a special red powder to dull her severe pain. Stern warnings echoed in her mind. The medicine possessed a harsh blood-red color and a pungent herbal scent so potent that a healthy body would violently reject it. Cold dread seized her heart as the truth dawned. The fragrance in her hands carried that exact same slightly sweet pungent scent. Mixture resting inside the jar was no harmless tea. It was the very same harsh drug from her past. Painful childhood memories flooded back to when she had eavesdropped on her mother, declaring Sylvia as her ultimate treasure, leaving young Ilya standing alone in the shadows, wondering where she fit in. As a servant quietly entered the room to serve fresh tea, the lingering question burned in her mind. If her sister was her mother's treasure, what did that make her? Maid explained that Lord Alfred had mentioned her indisposition, prompting her to check in, but Ilya composed herself and politely assured the servant that she was fine. Turning back toward the maid with a cold, resolute expression, she requested a specific favor. Standing quietly in her chambers, Ilya asked the maid to call the staff member responsible for managing the keys. Though the request seemed simple, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease creeping over her as she examined the small bottle in her hands. Her mind weighed heavy with growing concern as she pondered the silent friction between herself and those around her. She recalled when Sylvia had collapsed from a fever the previous week, although the doctor assured them it was nothing serious, merely an adjustment to academy life. Sylvia had been deeply relieved by the news. Knock at the door interrupted her thoughts as the cleaning staff arrived. The maid announced that the key manager was away, so a senior staff member had brought the keys instead. The very maid Ilya had previously seen laughing happily alongside Sylvia. Noticing the maid's nervous posture, she recognized that while she had been raised never to draw too close to servants, Sylvia held no such boundaries. Deciding to test the situation, she handed the small bottle to the maid and instructed her to deliver it to the lord. He granted the maid permission to report everything to her superiors, fully aware that the head steward was likely monitoring her every move and granting access to sensitive rooms with malicious intent. As the frightened maid turned to leave, Ilya pondered the absurd contrast between her life and Sylvia's. No matter what tragedy befell her, Sylvia and Mother would continue living happily as if nothing had changed. Stepping out into the grand hallway, she noted with irony how freely everyone entered Sylvia's room. Despite claiming she wasn't present, she realized that placing a young maid under constant surveillance meant the girl could easily be used as a disposable pawn if things went awry. Addressing the maid directly, she acknowledged the cruel reality of the environment they were forced to inhabit while examining the lock mechanism. Turning her attention to the room's interior, she asked where Sylvia kept the tea leaves that Mother had gifted her. Inspecting the vanity table filled with delicate decorations, she discovered the plain glass jar of tea leaves, remembering how Sylvia always decorated container bottles before presenting them to others. Holding the small glass bottle, memories of Mother's affectionate embrace washed over her mind, bringing a deep, painful longing. Overwhelmed by bitter confusion, she's questioned why Sylvia always looked so happy and why Mother seemed to harbor resentment toward her. She reflected on how desperately she had craved pure, unselfish love in her pitch-black world, until the maid's sudden cry snapped her back to reality. She stood startled as the frantic maid rushed in, desperately shouting at her to stop and warning that the room belonged to Lady Sylvia. The maid tried to intervene, but she was shoved aside without hesitation and ordered to get out of the way. Reflecting on her past, she remembered how her mother had always favored her sister, gently stroking her hair as if to display her affection, leaving her to believe that she could only be happy if she were Sylvia. Suddenly, her mother walked into the doorway, calling out her name with a cold, piercing presence that caused the glass container to fall and shatter on the floor. As the small glass jar rolled away, she slumped back on the floor, contemplating how those who have abandoned all hope often wear the most serene smiles. Mother observed her quietly, asking if she truly understood what she was doing, while a dark, shadowy figure sat silently watching in the background. With an elegant yet icy expression, her mother noted that those who feel helpless often hide behind smiles, before directly accusing her of stealing the container from Sylvia's room. Standing firm, her mother scolded her for taking things that belonged to her sister, emphasizing that such behavior was unacceptable, leaving her stunned by a direct reprimand she had never experienced before. Inspecting the spilled contents, her mother casually dismissed them, claiming they were merely medicinal herbs when asked what was inside. Looking down at the shattered glass, she questioned whether her mother was truly aware of the actual contents hidden within those herbs. Mother responded with calm confidence, asking what could possibly be hidden from her, asserting that she was the one who had made them in the first place. Harsh realization hit her instantly as her mother called her a foolish child, leaving her trembling in shock as she pondered the terrible implication of what had been done. A soft, gentle voice that contrasted with her previous harshness, her mother urged her not to misunderstand, claiming she loved her too, but questioning why she would act this way if she truly cherished her sister's health. Silent desperation, she pleaded internally for her mother to refute the horrifying truth and confirm that the mixture was not poison. As her mother spoke fondly of Sylvia as a precious princess, she struggled with the painful reality of where she truly stood in her mother's heart. She stood frozen as her mother coldly declared that Sylvia was simply no good and should never have enrolled in the academy. Desperate to defend her sister, the young noblewoman tried to object, but her mother cut her off sharply, reiterating with chilling finality that Sylvia was flawed. Continuing her cold monologue, her mother insisted that despite Sylvia doing her best, it was not enough. Regretting that she had not opposed the academy proposal more fiercely, she spoke of promises made to her husband and her beloved child, gripping her sleeve tightly as her emotions simmered beneath the surface. The bitter expression, her mother explained that her husband had only relented because Sylvia had begged so desperately. As the girl stammered out a hesitant question, her mother acknowledged full awareness of her own actions and declared with cold resolve that she knew exactly what had to be done next. Mother noted that Sylvia had grown far too lively since attending the academy, something she could not tolerate after ensuring the girl drank the prepared poison. Shaking with sudden fury, her mother snapped that Sylvia should never have become like that. Before any further words could be exchanged, a sharp blade was drawn and plunged forward in a swift, violent motion. Blood splattered violently across the room as the sudden strike took its terrible toll. Mother collapsed lifelessly to the floor in a pool of blood, leaving the young woman standing in utter shock. Splattered with blood, she touched her face in disbelief, barely able to comprehend the horrifying tragedy that had just unfolded before her eyes. Confusion and dread set in as a soft, trembling voice calls out in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the horrifying turn of events. Blood-stained blade lies discarded on the floor next to a lifeless body, leaving her to question why this tragedy occurred despite thinking she knew everything. She sits in shock beside the fallen figure, her dark gown speckled with fresh blood as she stares down at her dying mother. Hesitantly, a hand reaches out toward the grieving girl, moving slowly through the silence. A gentle touch of bloodied fingers against her skin brings a muted response as she looks down in sorrowful silence. In the void of the quiet room, she remains motionless before the tragic sight. Faint broken whisper breaks the heavy silence, feebly calling out her name. Eyes widen in shock as her mother gasps out faint apologies. Pleading desperately, she begs her mother to stay with her. With her final breaths, the dying mother offers gentle reassurances despite the fatal wound across her chest. Light fades from her mother's eyes, leaving the young woman frozen in horror as reality crashes down upon her. As the lifeless hand drops onto the floor, she clutches her chest, overwhelmed by the crushing grief. She wonders silently whether a scream escaped her lips in that moment, or if her voice was entirely stolen by agony. Meanwhile, servants approach outside the open doorway, their blurred vision slowly clearing as they converse about her whereabouts. Stepping into the doorway, the butler suddenly gasps in terror as he catches sight of the gruesome scene inside. Spurred into immediate action by the bloodstains, he yells for the maid to summon the lord immediately. As the household servants gathered at the doorway in utter disbelief, the young lord confronted the grief-stricken daughter, demanding to know what she had done to her mother. Stammering through her shock, she desperately pleaded her innocence, asserting that she had done nothing at all. In truth, she had only wanted to ask her mother about the mysterious tea leaves added to Sylvia's jar. Unable to fully comprehend the truth behind her mother's sudden confession. Looking down at her trembling palms, she realized with horror that her hands and face were sullied with her mother's blood, drawing a deeply concerned glare from the noble youth. Quietly asking if she might be excused to wash the crimson stain from her hands, she began to step away, prompting an immediate outcry from the stunned onlookers. Before anyone could press her further, Marge boldly stepped forward to shield her, declaring firmly that her young lady was entirely blameless. Pressed for details about what she had witnessed at the scene, the head maid steadfastly maintained that she had seen nothing. Surrounding nobles pondered why Marge would defend her so fiercely despite now serving another, while the senior's attendant suggested a broader, more thorough investigation was needed. The discussion was suddenly cut short as a frantic guard burst into the room to report an urgent emergency, forcing the young lord to depart immediately with his men. The atmosphere heavy with tension, Alfred prepared to take his leave, coldly instructing the grieving girl to return to her quarters. Sudden clamor echoed down the grand hallway as the uniformed guards began assembling in haste. Fellow officer called out to him to hurry along, leaving her watching silently as the men rushed toward the source of the commotion. He quietly pondered Alfred's true thoughts, certain that while he might not know the full truth of her mother's death, word of the tragic incident had surely reached his ears. Rain poured down in relentless sheets around Ilya, heavy drops splattering against her dark umbrella as she stood alone in solemn silence. Mind drifted to thoughts of her mother, a woman abandoned in a foreign land after believing in a knight's devotion, bound by duty and affection to a princess who never truly returned it. Stepping through the downpour, Sylvia approached her with wide, pleading eyes, desperately seeking answers about whether she had truly stolen the prized tea leaves left behind by their mother. Desperate for reassurance, the younger sister implored her to deny the rumor, clinging to the belief that she could never commit such a betrayal. Looking down with a detached, distant expression, she quietly challenged how Sylvia could place any trust in her at all amid such damning rumors. Wavering for a second, Sylvia adamantly refused to believe the accusations, insisting that her sister was simply not the kind of person who would ever commit such an act. She continued to defend her against the harsh gossip spreading through the estate, asserting her sister's underlying kindness until she sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Suddenly, Lord Soleil arrived alongside Sylvia, his voice breaking through the rain as he called out her name, confronting her with the very sight she had hoped to avoid. Looking upon them both, she finally uttered a quiet confession, admitting that she had indeed stolen what belonged to her sister. With stark clarity, she repeated the admission directly to Sylvia, leaving her younger sister frozen in utter shock. Stammering in disbelief, Sylvia struggled to comprehend the betrayal, demanding to know why she would ever claim such a terrible thing. Without flinching, she turned the sharp accusation back onto Sylvia, pointing out that she was hardly innocent of doing the exact same thing. Overwhelmed with distress, Sylvia desperately denied taking anything, tearfully protesting her innocence while clinging to her belief in her sister's goodness. Beneath her composure, Ilya's inner thoughts raged against the injustice of a sister born only months after her, whose mere arrival brought a joy she could never comprehend. As rain fell around them, the bitter truth hung heavy between them, a silent condemnation that everything meant for her had been cruelly taken away. Voice trembled with a cocktail of bitterness and grief as she declared that everything had been stolen from her, fully expecting the theft of her future to continue. Memories of the past resurfaced, recalling her mother's vivid journals that detailed how her father loved the newborn baby, cradling her with warmth while ignoring her own existence. Stepping forward in confusion, the young man reached out to comfort her, but she aggressively knocked his hand away, refusing to be touched. Recoiled slightly, begging her not to soil her beautiful hands, calling out her name in desperate concern. He glared back, rejecting his reach and insisting that his warmth was not meant for a body bathed in blood like hers. Turning away, the noble turned his attention toward the pure sister, who softly grasped his sleeve for comfort. A profound sense of isolation settled over her as she watched the two of them stand together, realizing he would inevitably choose the untainted sister. Knowing she had no way of stopping him from leaving, she accepted that his gentle touch had never been truly meant for her. Standing alone under the pouring rain, she questioned why no one would stay by her side or guide her on how to keep living. Mind flashed back to her dying mother, a woman who had spent her entire life hiding her true feelings behind a polite, silent smile. The image of her mother's blood-splattered face burned into her memory as the dying woman uttered her final tragic words of affection. She had been unable to look away as her mother passed, initially hoping the brutal reality was merely a cruel joke. Even as she grew, she held on to the desperate hope that her mother truly loved her, despite being forced to pretend otherwise. Looking at her innocent sister, she constantly reassured herself that their family's coldness was just hidden affection. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the rain as her father arrived, shouting out her name in sharp command. She stood in silent torment, recognizing that he was not wrong to assume she was the sole reason her sister was shedding tears. As the torrential rain poured down around them, tears streamed silently down her own face, her heart thumping violently against her ribs. Caught in the depth of her grief, the sight of a falling black feather triggered a vivid memory, ringing a desperate call for Crow directly from her heart. In an instant, a burst of dark plumage surged around her, engulfing her vision as the mysterious creature's presence manifested in full force. The world faded into darkness. She found herself longing for everything to simply cease, even as a voice recalled that an hopelessly tangled thread requires bold intervention. Truth echoed clearly through the gloom. To repair a knot so convoluted, one must first cut the strand before it can ever be tied anew. The sharp, decisive action, the blades closed, severing the illuminated thread once and for all. Sudden snap like scissors cutting through fabric echoed in the dark. Black feathers engulfed her vision, leaving her unsure whether her eyes were open or closed. Faint memories stirred, echoing a mother's gentle yet authoritative tone, calling Ilya her precious princess while pleading for someone to hold her pitiful child. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs, echoing inside her like a heavy bell pounding to the point of shattering. Snapping back to reality, she became acutely aware of what she had done and what she had to do next as her mother murmured weakly. Breath caught in her throat as an overwhelming sense of familiarity washed over her, realizing she had witnessed this exact scene once before. Trembling atmosphere confirmed the impossible truth of her sudden reality. Standing in the middle of the room, she understood that time itself had reversed right before her eyes. Refusing to allow tragedy to repeat, she lunged forward and firmly grabbed her mother's hand before the sharp blades could inflict harm. Desperate strength, she tackled her mother to the floor, forcing the weapon away from her neck. Scissors clattered harmlessly across the wooden floorboards as she pinned her mother securely. Clasping her mother's frail wrist, she felt the woman tremble beneath her as faint words escaped her mother's lips. Feeling the sharp bone beneath her mother's skin, she realized just how alarmingly thin her mother had become. Overwhelmed by tears, she wondered why it had been so easy to stop her this time when her mother had died so effortlessly in her past life. Mother glared back up with cold, tear-filled eyes, bitterly accusing Ilya of being the sole reason Sylvia had turned out this way. He went on to blame Ilya for triggering Sylvia's departure, leaving her words hanging heavily in the room. He listened in stunned silence as her mother coldly accused her of manipulation, pointing out how Sylvia had been sent to the academy, while her husband's heart remained unmoved by anyone else. Instead of addressing why she had attempted her own life, the woman simply questioned if she had been wrong, leaving the young noblewoman to process the unsettling truth that her mother had survived this timeline. She stared down at her trembling hands, plagued by an unbearable sense of dread, despite knowing that altering the outcome should have brought relief. She reflected on how across countless regressions, nothing had ever gone according to plan, with every past effort only twisting fate further beyond her control. Yet this time felt different. By saving her mother's life, she had finally altered the flow of time through her own will, earning a rare moment of self-validation. She felt any fleeting comfort vanish as she looked into her mother's dark green eyes, which burned not with gratitude but with absolute contempt. The older woman questioned whether another mistake had been made, revealing that her husband had never truly loved Sylvia, but rather Sylvia's mother, the late princess. She listened as her mother continued with a distant, intoxicated gaze, explaining how her husband remained ever a loyal servant to the deceased princess, granting whatever request honored her memory, including Sylvia's desire to attend the academy, despite her own futile protests. She watched silently as her mother confessed to having felt dead inside for years, observing how Sylvia had long since surrendered all hope and given up on ever leaving the estate. She clutched her mother tighter in horror, asking if she had truly been aware of Sylvia's silent despair all along. She flinched as her mother turned a harsh gaze upon her, shouting an accusation that she had deliberately locked Sylvia away despite knowing the girl had already surrendered all hope. She absorbed the bitter details as her mother justified confining Sylvia to the mansion under the pretext of her frail health, forcing the desperate girl to resort to poison as her only escape. She listened in disbelief as her mother switched to a hauntingly tender tone, professing deep love for Sylvia, and describing how she had meticulously cared for the girl who envied healthy people. He questioned the twisted definition of care, as her mother softly affirmed it, declaring with chilly devotion that Sylvia would forever remain her sweet little princess and her only true daughter. He felt the chilling words strike her with sudden, agonizing clarity as her mother apologized directly to her by name. He physically recoiled, desperate to block out the devastating confession before the final truth could be spoken. He begged her mother to stop speaking, weeping uncontrollably as she implored her to keep the painful reality unspoken. He listened in anguish as her mother revealed her own unresolved childhood trauma of losing her mother's affection upon Sylvia's birth, while inwardly pleading for any lie rather than hearing that she herself had never been loved. She collapsed to her knees, her voice trembling in desperation, as she begged her mother to utter the words she longed to hear, pleading to be told that she was loved. Terrified of hearing the truth, she kept her hands pressed firmly over her mother's mouth, knowing that hearing a final rejection would shatter her world entirely as the words mother and mom echoed silently in her mind. Tears streamed down her face as she looked directly into her mother's eyes, asking one last time if she loved her, only to catch a glimpse of a small, helpless girl reflected within her mother's cold pupils. Watching from the doorway, Lord Soleil was struck by the heartbreaking sight of her weeping figure, silently crying out for someone to save her from this unbearable despair, while she herself continued to pray for salvation. Soleil questioned Ilya intently, asking if she truly had no intention of harming her mother. He answered firmly that she did not intend to kill her, though her composure remained unreadable. Soleil began to apologize, attempting to brush off the earlier commotion as mere confusion, but she flatly cut him off with a stern refusal. Pressed further, challenging her claim by pointing out that her hands had been wrapped around her mother's neck until intervention occurred. She explained that her sole intention was to stop her mother from answering, while a servant stepped forward to interject. The servant pointed out that Ilya appeared to be injured as she sat silently on the floor. Realizing the pain in her arm, she noted it must have occurred during the struggle over the knife found in the room. Soleil presented the ornate dagger, and Ilya quietly claimed ownership of the weapon. Observing the deep wound dripping blood onto the floor, Soleil urged her to sit down before it left a permanent scar. After confirming the knife belonged to her, she requested a doctor to attend to her wound. Soleil questioned what she had intended to do with such a weapon, noting its various potential uses. Looking at her mother's faint, unsettling smile, Ilya began to perceive the true nature of her facade. No matter how deep the agony or pain she felt, her mother was capable of simply smiling as if it were nothing. Recognizing how masterfully her mother concealed her emotions, Ilya observed her unwavering expression. As her mother stood nearby, Ilya watched her closely, acutely aware of the deep deception beneath her calm exterior. She stood frozen as the horrifying truth struck her. Her mother had tried to take her own life. Before she could process the shock, her father rushed into the room, demanding an explanation for the chaotic scene. Ignoring his harsh accusations, she turned her gaze toward her mother, questioning in silence whether defending her own life was truly wrong. Despite the second chance at life she had been given, the agonizing reality remained unchanged, compelling her to voice the bitter truth that her mother had never loved her. Calling how she had been condemned and cast aside in her past, she resolved never again to remain silent while others plotted against her. Knowing that neither parent would ever extend a hand to shield her, she accepted that her survival depended entirely on her own strength. Turning to her father, she pressed him directly, asking if he had ever considered the hidden anguish his actions inflicted on those around him. As he sputtered in disbelief, she demanded that he recognize the immense pain her mother had been quietly enduring. Outraged by her audacity, he shouted for her to stop, but she shifted her attention away from him to address the trembling maid, Marge. With unyielding clarity, she revealed that her mother had secret instructions left behind with the maid. Father gasped in shock, completely caught off guard by her intimate knowledge of the situation. As Marge nervously produced the hidden document, she informed her father that the letter held all the answers to her mother's true feelings. Though surrounded by their ringing condemnation and judgment, she stood her ground against the relentless pressure. Looking at her mother, she asked with raw desperation if she had ever truly been considered a daughter worth protecting. Thinking under the overwhelming weight of heartbreak, she wept openly, crying out for the love her parents had denied her for so long. She stood in agonizing silence as Sylvia approached, her sister calling out in gentle concern. Despite being urged to return to her room and keep her distance, Sylvia continued to draw closer, lamenting how she felt as though she might as well be dead. Step by step, Sylvia advanced, the atmosphere grew tense, and Ilya firmly warned her sister not to step any closer. Questioning why she was forbidden from drawing near, Sylvia watched as Ilya silently pulled away, refusing to let her get close. Soleil entered the room and immediately commanded Sylvia to step away from Ilya, questioning why she was even present during what was meant to be his scheduled checkup. Praising Sylvia's kindness for coming to check on her sister, Soleil then raised a critical question, asking why Ilya had not yet received medical treatment while the doctor remained waiting outside. Deep resentment surged as the stark contrast hit. Why should fragile, pristine Sylvia be protected and showcased while Ilya was discarded? Intense wave of hatred erupted inside her, screaming silently that someone like Sylvia must never touch her or come anywhere near her again. Distraught, Sylvia wept over Ilya's condition, turning to her parents to demand why they were doing nothing, while Ilya sat bleeding from her injuries. Calling how Sylvia had always maintained a soft, reassuring face while everyone else gave up on her, Ilya reflected on how her parents quickly abandoned her in favor of her sister. Sylvia reached out, softly comforting Ilya and confessing her affection, yet acknowledging the painful truth that she had stolen everything from her. As her mother calmly questioned the situation, the tension in the room reached a breaking point with Ilya standing frozen. Sylvia asked why her sister was acting this way. Soleil sharply ordered her once more to get away from Ilya, demanding an immediate end to it. Bitter anguish overwhelmed her thoughts, questioning the unfairness of why her life, her happiness, and everything that was hers had been taken away. Despite Sylvia being the only one who truly believed in her until the end, jealousy and grief consumed Ilya. Seeing how Sylvia was showered with the love of her parents and Soleil, unable to bear the emotional turmoil any longer, her mother finally snapped, screaming at Ilya that she had had enough. He observed her sister weeping openly, agonizing over the fact that no one was stepping forward to offer comfort, wishing desperately that they could simply walk hand in hand toward a brighter future. Turning to love and cherish her younger sibling, She reached out tenderly to touch her cheek, confessing how deeply she had always wanted to hold her dear, yet a lingering reluctance held her back. Despite every gentle intention and earnest desire, she ultimately could not bring herself to love her. Realizing she was no different from their mother, who on her deathbed confessed a total lack of affection for her own child, she cried out the painful truth that she could never love the girl who had stolen everything from her. During the bitter rejection, the young sister wept softly with a gentle forgiving smile, revealing that she had known the truth all along, and quietly reassuring her that it was gentle words of reassurance were offered to calm her sister's worries. She responded calmly, revealing that she already understood everything that was happening. Simple acknowledgement passed between them in silent accord. Noticing the stains on her attire, a mild warning was whispered, but she merely accepted it without complaint. Urgent calls for medical assistance echoed down the hallway, as the severity of the situation became clear and worries arose over her well-being. Physicians stepped in to treat her immediately, preventing further risks while she offered to lead her back to safety. He urged her to remain where she was and rest, wondering why she continued to act so kindly despite everything. Advising her to follow their father's wishes, she reminded her not to get in the doctor's way. Questions lingered in her mind as she reflected on the harsh truth that she simply did not love her. Observing her pure and innocent expression, she questioned why such gentle words were spoken at all. She reflected on how isolated her sister had been in her room, struggling to adapt to academy life without friends or support. In a new environment full of strangers, it was no surprise that she had grown to rely entirely on Soleil. Despite offering comfort, she gently brushed her hands away, insisting that she could manage on her own. Looking at her, a quiet realization washed over her about the distance between them. As a formal greeting echoed in the grand hall, she faced the somber truth that she had been alone from the very beginning. She sat quietly as her visitor gently inquired if she was feeling better, though her companion noted that she still looked unwell, despite her fever having subsided. She understated the severity of her injury, reassuring her guest that it was nothing serious. Yet the lingering question remained whether it would leave a permanent scar. Blade-inflicted injuries were mentioned. Her guest explained that such wounds tend to leave lasting marks. Catching the reference to a blade, she paused thoughtfully, realizing the true nature of what had transpired. Looking uncertain, her visitor confessed an inability to share specific details regarding the incident. The blonde noblewoman hesitated before speaking, remarking how high society generally disdains violent conflicts. He continued explaining that rumors spread quickly whenever an unmarried noble lady suffers an injury of that nature, though Lord Soleil likely had no intention of breaking off their engagement. Her gaze grew solemn as she reflected on a long-standing position she could not break free from, contrasting the wrist injury against the far heavier burdens she had carried for so long. The subtle twitch of her hand upon her dress, her inner tension flickered beneath her composed exterior. Facing her visitor directly, she insisted that she was fine, though internally she struggled with the inability to share her true feelings. Observing that no one else was present in the room, Lady Marianne gently urged her to speak up if there was anything she needed. Marianne reminded her of their past conversation in the courtyard, offering unconditional aid as a member of a high-ranking count's family if she ever required assistance. Her hand gripped her skirt tightly, knowing that Marianne's status made her a reliable ally who would keep her word regardless of the request. Pressing further, Marianne asked if she truly intended not to ask for any assistance at all. Looking back with resolve, she quietly firmly declared that there was no need, deciding she would make her utmost effort on her own for the sake of a dear friend. Reflecting on her lifelong isolation, she recognized that while her visitor might expect her to risk everything, she could not put her life on the line for actions that would not yield genuine progress. As Marianne struggled to comprehend the boundary between friendship and love in their world, she softly affirmed her belief that genuine affection and friendship could indeed exist. She reflected on the gentle visitor's proposal, recognizing that someone who had lived entirely in soft sunlight could never truly comprehend the darkness she had experienced, even while offering sincere friendship. Words fell like a fresh drop of water upon a dried-out heart, leaving a radiant impression as the young noblewoman announced it was time for her to take her leave. Stepping quietly toward the door, Marianne mentioned that Lord Soleil would soon be visiting, urging her host to rest rather than see her off, to which Ilya offered her quiet thanks. As the door closed behind her visitor, a heavy silence settled over the room, leaving her alone once more with her thoughts. She mused on how certain events in life lie entirely beyond control, pondering whether those whose fates seem altered were ever truly destined for a different path in the first place. Continuing her solemn contemplation, she realized that inescapable events were not merely fate but destiny itself, cold, inorganic, and absolute. Her attention was suddenly drawn to the window, where a jet-black crow perched on a branch outside, watching her with uncanny, controlled focus. Reaching out toward the glass, she questioned if her departing guest had noticed the mysterious bird lingering outside. Dark avian perched before her spoke, identifying itself as Crow, the bird of ill omen, revealing that this was not the first time such an unavoidable tea party had brought souls together. Confronted by the talking bird's ominous pronouncement, she pondered if this immutable sequence of events was a punishment for some terrible, unknown transgression.